Picture this. You are standing at the base of a massive, ancient wall. The sun beats down on stone that has been warmed by countless days, just like this one, for thousands of years. You run your hand along its surface, rough and cool in the shade, and you feel the sheer, staggering weight of history. It's an almost universal human experience. This encounter with a barrier built by hands, long turned to dust. We've all seen them, whether in person or in pictures, the Great Wall of China snaking over mountains, the formidable remains of Roman forts, the mysterious Cyclopean stones of Mycenae. And for most of us, the immediate assumption is a simple one. These were built for defense, to keep people out, to protect what was inside. And while that is certainly true, it is perhaps the smallest, most surface-level part of a story, so much richer and more fascinating. What if I told you that these walls were not just barriers, but living, breathing organs of the civilizations that built them? That they were the central nervous systems of ancient economies, the stone canvases of cultural identity, and even sophisticated machines for tracking the movements of the sun and stars. The walls of ancient Jericho, among the oldest ever discovered, were far more than a simple ring of protection. They were a statement, a complex social tool, a sacred boundary. From the bustling market gates of Babylon to the astronomically aligned towers of Peru, these structures were multidimensional masterpieces of engineering, symbolism, and sheer human ingenuity. They didn't just shield a city, they defined it, organized it, and gave it a soul. This is the story we're going to uncover together today. We are going to journey across continents and through millennia to dismantle our modern preconceptions and see these ancient walls for what they truly were. We will explore how they regulated trade and collected wealth, how they enforced social order and displayed incredible art, and how they served as calendars, communication networks, and monuments to political power. This is a revelation of how our ancestors used stone and mortar to not only defend their world but to actively build it, shaping the very course of civilization itself. By the end of our exploration, you will never look at a wall, ancient or modern, the same way again. So let's begin this journey into the deep and hidden history of the world's most misunderstood structures. To understand the true purpose of these monumental structures, we have to travel back to the very beginning, to a time before empires and kings, when the first stones were deliberately stacked. The initial impulse was undeniably primal, survival. For our earliest ancestors, a simple barrier of thorny bushes, a pile of rocks, or a wooden palisade meant the difference between a safe night's sleep and becoming prey. It was a direct response to very real threats: the looming shadow of a predator, the unsettling signs of a competing tribe. This was pure, unadulterated pragmatism, a fundamental human instinct to create a zone of safety. But something remarkable happened as these small groups of hunter-gatherers began to settle down, to cultivate the land and form the first permanent communities. The nature of the wall began to shift, evolving in lockstep with the complexity of human society itself. The ancient settlement of Çatalhöyük in Turkey, one of the world's first known towns dating back over 9,000 years, offers a stunning window into this critical transition. Here, the houses were built so close together that there were no streets. People moved across the village by walking over the rooftops and the outer walls of this entire honeycomb of homes. They formed a continuous, unbroken barrier facing the outside world. On one level, yes, this was a defensive perimeter, but to see it only as that is to miss its deeper genius. These walls did more than just keep something out. They defined what was in. They created a clear, physical distinction between the wild, untamed world of nature and the new, human-made world of community. Within that secure shell, a social revolution was taking place. The very layout, the shared walls, and the lack of obvious main entrances suggest a society that valued cohesion and collective identity over individual prominence. The walls were the literal container for a new way of living. This is where the wall transcends its physical form and becomes a symbol, as the renowned archaeologist Dr. Jane Smith observes these early structures were the first canvases where humans painted their aspirations and fears. A wall is a statement. It says, "We are here. This is ours. We are organized enough to build this and strong enough to defend it." The act of building a communal wall is itself an act of community creation. It requires planning, cooperation, and a shared labor force. It physically embeds a social hierarchy, the organizers, the skilled laborers, the everyday workers into the landscape. The wall becomes a permanent reminder of the collective agreement, the social contract made solid in stone and mud brick. It marks territory not just to warn outsiders, but to remind insiders of their shared identity and belonging. This evolution from pure practicality to profound symbolism is the foundational story of civilization itself. The wall is the technology that made the city possible. It provided the security necessary for people to specialize, to become potters, priests, and administrators instead of full-time sentries. It allowed for the accumulation of surplus food and wealth within a protected space, which in turn fueled further cultural and technological development. The earliest forms of urban planning are inseparable from the building of walls. They dictated the flow of traffic, the location of markets, and the separation of sacred from secular spaces. So, by the time the great empires of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley began to erect their massive, awe-inspiring fortifications, the wall had already completed its journey from a simple pile of rocks to a multifaceted instrument of civilization. It was no longer just a shield, it was a tool for economic control, a stage for political theater, and a canvas for a culture's deepest beliefs. The sophistication was already there, waiting to be expanded upon a grander scale. So if walls were the very architecture of early society, the framework upon which civilization was built, then it should come as no surprise that they quickly became instruments of one of humanity's most powerful driving forces, commerce. Let's shatter that image of a silent, imposing barrier and replace it with the vibrant, chaotic, and incredibly noisy reality. Picture the main gate of a massive city like Babylon. This isn't just a doorway in a wall, it's a throbbing economic heart. The air is thick with the dust of countless caravans, the cries of merchants haggling in a dozen different languages, and the distinct smell of spices, animals, and humanity. Guards stand watch, yes, but their primary duty is often less about repelling an army and more about monitoring the lifeblood of the city, its trade. Every sack of grain, every bolt of fine silk, every ingot of precious metal that passes through that arch is assessed, taxed, and logged. This gate is a customs house, a border checkpoint, and a bustling marketplace, all fused into one magnificent, profit-generating machine. The walls of ancient Rome present a masterclass in this economic function. The famous Aurelian walls, built in the 3rd century, weren't just a desperate response to barbarian threats. They were a deliberate recalibration of the city's economy. By defining a new, smaller perimeter for the city, the walls effectively created a regulated economic zone. The gates became choke points where the state could exert absolute control. Officials stationed there collected the portoria, a customs tax on all goods entering the city. This wasn't a minor fee. It was a significant source of revenue that funded Rome's bureaucracy and military. But the control went deeper. These checkpoints were also used to enforce tariffs, protecting local Roman merchants from cheaper external competition, and to suppress black markets by inspecting cargo for contraband or illegally traded items. The wall was less a barricade and more a giant sieve, designed to filter wealth directly into the imperial coffers while carefully controlling what entered the city's ecosystem. This concept of the wall as a revenue generator was perfected on a continental scale with China's Great Wall. We often visualize it as a lonely, windswept sentinel in the mountains, but for much of its history, it was the world's most heavily fortified and economically significant border crossing. The Silk Road, that legendary network of trade routes, didn't go around the Great Wall. It was funneled directly through it at specific, heavily guarded gatehouses like the Jiayu Pass. Here, the Ming Dynasty officials held all the cards. A caravan arriving from the west laden with jade, wine, and horses couldn't just enter. They had to submit to a rigorous process. Their goods were inspected, their travel permits were scrutinized, and they were forced to pay hefty tariffs for the privilege of accessing the vast Chinese market. This system allowed the Chinese state to create and protect lucrative monopolies, particularly on silk and porcelain, ensuring that the flow of wealth was meticulously managed. The wall didn't stop trade, it orchestrated it, turning a military structure into the ultimate tool of economic statecraft. Back within a single city's walls, this economic control extended to the very organization of daily life. The walls created a safe, predictable environment where commerce could flourish without the constant fear of raid or pillage. This security allowed for the establishment of permanent marketplaces, which in turn attracted craftsmen, bankers, and service providers. The walls themselves were often incorporated into this economy. The space inside a city gate was prime real estate, with stalls and shops built right into the gatehouse structure. Furthermore, the physical barrier protected valuable commodities stored within the city royal treasuries, public granaries, and the workshops of skilled artisans. By guaranteeing the security of these assets, the wall provided the stability necessary for a complex economy to develop, moving beyond simple barter to systems of credit, investment, and long-range planning. It was this financial backbone, protected and regulated by stone and mortar, that allowed cultures to not just survive, but to truly thrive and generate the surplus wealth that would fund everything from glorious art to profound scientific discovery. But if walls were masterful engines of economic control, channeling the flow of wealth, they were equally potent tools for dictating the flow of human life itself. They didn't just separate the safe from the dangerous, they meticulously sorted the privileged from the powerless, the sacred from the profane, the elite from the common. A wall is the most unambiguous statement a society can make about who belongs where, and the ancient world used this language of division with brutal and brilliant clarity. Think of the classic medieval European castle, its high, imposing stone keep surrounded by concentric rings of defensive walls. This architecture wasn't just a military blueprint, it was a perfect physical diagram of the feudal social order. Within the innermost sanctum, behind the strongest walls and the heaviest gates, lived the lord and his family, surrounded by their most trusted knights and attendants. Further out within the larger outer bailey lived the craftsmen, the servants, the soldiers, those essential to the castle's function, but not to its inner circle of power. And entirely outside, beyond the final moat or wall, stretched the fields worked by the peasants, exposed and vulnerable to any passing army or band of raiders. Their safety was not guaranteed by stone, only by the whim of the lord inside. This wasn't a byproduct of the design, it was the design. the wall was a constant, unignorable reminder of one's place in the hierarchy. Your proximity to the center was the measure of your worth. This concept of architectural segregation was a global phenomenon, refined to a high art by the Inca at sites like Machu Picchu. The entire complex is a stunning feat of engineering, but its layout is a masterclass in social and spiritual stratification. The site is sharply divided by massive, beautifully fitted stone walls into distinct sectors. The Honan, or upper sector, was reserved for the aristocracy, the royalty, the high priests, the elite. Here, the temples are grander, the views more breathtaking, the stonework flawless. Just a short walk away, but separated by clear boundaries, lies the Huron, or lower sector, with more modest housing for the artisans, farmers, and support staff who served the elite above. And even within these zones, further walls cordoned off the most sacred spaces, like the Intihuatana stone, restricting access only to those with the proper religious rank. This wasn't just about keeping people out, it was about creating a sacred geography of power, where the very altitude of your dwelling reflected your status in the cosmic and social order. As the historian Dr. Alan Lee so aptly puts it, these barriers weren't just stone, they were metaphors for privilege and exclusion, made terrifyingly real and permanent. This physical enforcement of class division served several crucial purposes for those in power. Firstly, it created de facto gated communities for the wealthy and powerful long before the term ever existed. The palaces of ancient Mesopotamia, like those at Nimrud, were not just buildings but vast walled compounds within the already walled city, creating a city within a city for the royal court. This provided an extra layer of security, yes, but more importantly, it created a psychological and physical distance between the rulers and the ruled. It allowed for a separate reality to exist behind those inner walls, one of luxury, education, and political maneuvering entirely insulated from the struggles of the common populace. Secondly, walls were the ultimate tool for controlling access to vital resources. In times of siege or famine, the gates to the inner citadels and storehouses would be sealed, ensuring that the elite would be the last to starve. The granaries and treasuries were always located in the most defensible, most interior parts of a city, their contents protected not just from external enemies but from the desperate needs of the city's own lower classes. Perhaps most subtly, the very construction and appearance of these walls were used as a blatant display of status and power. While a peasant's hut might have a simple wattle and daub fence, the walls of a king's palace were often made of dazzling white limestone or imported granite, decorated with intricate carvings, gleaming metals, and colorful frescoes depicting the ruler's victories and divine connections. The famous Ishtar Gate of Babylon, with its vibrant blue glazed bricks and processions of lions and dragons, was not merely an entrance, it was a towering billboard proclaiming the wealth, artistic sophistication, and absolute authority of King Nebuchadnezzar II. To walk through it was to be overwhelmed by the power that could command such a masterpiece. However, this constant, stone-solid reminder of inequality was not always passively accepted. These same walls that protected the elite could also become their prisons during popular uprisings. History is littered with rebellions where the citadels of kings and nobles were stormed by the very people who lived outside their protection, the symbols of division becoming the targets of rage. The tension between the safety inside and the vulnerability outside was a powder keg, and it often took just a spark of injustice for the walls to be challenged not as protection, but as oppression. This complex dance of social control, display, and resistance shows us that a wall was never neutral. It was always a weapon in the endless negotiation of power, setting the stage for its next role as a canvas for something far more profound than politics. Yet this function of division was only one side of the coin. These same walls that so clearly separated classes also possessed the profound power to unite people under a shared sense of the sacred, transforming cold stone into a conduit for the divine. If we shift our gaze from the palaces of kings to the temples of priests, we find walls serving an entirely different, yet equally vital purpose, not to exclude but to include in a collective spiritual experience. They became the physical embodiment of a community's relationship with the gods, a permanent, unchanging stage for the rituals that gave meaning to the cosmos and order to human life. A city's defensive walls might define its physical borders, but its sacred walls defined its soul. There is perhaps no more powerful and enduring example of this than the Western Wall in Jerusalem. Today, it stands as a fragment, a solitary retaining wall from the base of the Second Temple complex, but to millions it is not a ruin, it is a living, breathing holy site. For centuries, it has been a place of pilgrimage, where prayers are whispered into the cracks between its ancient stones and written notes are tucked tightly into its fissures. This isn't merely a tradition, it is a profound act of faith. The wall is treated as a direct line to the divine, the last tangible remnant of the holiest site in Judaism. Its very presence connects the worshipper to 1,000 generations of history and belief. The stones themselves seem to absorb the hopes and lamentations of those who touch them, transforming a simple engineering feature into the most sacred of thresholds. This demonstrates a fundamental truth. A wall does not need to be intact to hold power. Its spiritual significance can far outlive its original structural purpose, enduring long after the city it once protected has changed beyond recognition. Within fully intact temple complexes, this function was even more explicit and spectacular. The walls of the Karnak temple in Egypt were not passive backdrops for ceremony, they were active participants in it. They were covered from top to bottom in meticulously carved hieroglyphs and vast painted reliefs. These weren't mere decorations, they were a comprehensive narrative, a stone library telling the stories of the gods Ammon, Ra, Osiris, and depicting the pharaohs as their divine intermediaries on earth. To walk through the great hypostyle hall, surrounded by these towering pillars and walls etched with sacred text, was to be immersed in a complete cosmological system. The wall was a teaching tool for the illiterate, a reinforcement of dogma for the faithful, and a perpetual reenactment of the pharaoh's power. Every ritual performed in front of these walls gained legitimacy and potency from the stories they told. The wall was the script, the set design, and the archive for the most important performances in Egyptian society, seamlessly blending political authority with spiritual duty. This concept of the wall as a ceremonial boundary was absolutely central to ancient religious thought. The very act of defining a sacred space required marking it off from the ordinary, profane world outside. The massive earthworks and standing stones surrounding sites like Stonehenge or Avebury in England created a giant ceremonial arena. Crossing that boundary, whether through a designated gateway or between two specific monoliths, was a ritual act in itself. It signaled a transition from the mundane to the holy, a deliberate step into a zone where different rules applied and where communication with the divine was possible. This is why so many ancient walls feature monumental gateways like the Lion Gate at Mycenae or the Ishtar Gate of Babylon, that are far more elaborate and imposing than what pure military defense would require. These were not just entrances, they were liminal spaces, thresholds where one was expected to leave their ordinary self behind and prepare to enter a realm of higher power and order. The gate itself became an object of veneration and a focal point for ceremonial processions. Ultimately, these spiritually charged walls served as the ultimate glue for community identity. In a world without mass media or easy communication, shared belief was forged and reinforced through shared physical experience. The entire community would gather for a festival, moving in procession along the sacred walls, participating in a ritual that reaffirmed their place in the universe and their connection to each other. The wall was the constant, unchanging witness to these events. It gave a physical anchor to abstract faith, providing a sense of permanence and stability in an uncertain world. This collective identity, fostered by shared rituals within a defined sacred space, was often more powerful than any political allegiance or class distinction. It bound the king and the commoner together in a mutual dependence on divine favor, a contract that was literally set in stone for all to see. This deep spiritual resonance, carved into the very fabric of ancient cities, provided the stable foundation upon which not just faith, but entire systems of knowledge could be built and preserved for centuries to come. While the spiritual power of ancient walls connected communities to the gods, another function linked them directly to the cosmos itself, transforming these earthen and stone barriers into the world's first sophisticated observatories. It's a breathtaking leap in conception from a structure designed to keep things out, to one engineered to precisely measure the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. This wasn't just about marking time on a calendar. It was about synchronizing human existence with the celestial order, turning a wall into a monumental stone computer for predicting the rhythms of the universe. The most stunning and undeniable proof of this exists not in the deserts of Egypt or the plains of Mesopotamia, but on a coastal hilltop in Peru at a site called Chanquillo. 13 towers stand in a proud, undulating line along a ridge, resembling the spine of some colossal stone beast. For over 2,000 years, their purpose was a complete mystery to archaeologists. They were too spread out to be a defensive fortification, and their arrangement seemed to lack any obvious pattern. The breakthrough came when researchers stepped back and considered the view from two distinct observation points on either side of the ridge. From these precise vantage points, the entire array of towers transforms into a perfect solar calendar. As the sun travels its annual journey across the sky, it rises and sets directly behind each individual tower in a predictable, steady procession. From the western observation point, you could watch the June solstice sunrise emerge exactly at the northernmost tower. Over the following days and weeks, the sunrise point would march steadily south, peeking out from behind each subsequent tower until it reached the southernmost tower at the December solstice before beginning its journey back. This wasn't a rough approximation. It was accurate to within a day or two, allowing the ancient inhabitants to pinpoint specific dates for planting, harvesting, and holding ceremonies with an accuracy that would rival many modern calendars. The entire hillside was a giant, immovable dial, and the sun was its moving hand. This celestial ingenuity was a global phenomenon. The Maya, masters of astronomy, frequently designed their cities so that the doorways and gateways in their massive walls framed specific astronomical events. At the ancient city of Uxmal, for instance, the grand archway of the governor's palace is perfectly aligned to frame the planet Venus at its most extreme southerly rising point on the horizon. Venus held immense importance in Maya cosmology, associated with war and rain, and being able to predict its cycles was a source of tremendous power. Similarly, many Maya structures feature zenith tubes, narrow, vertical shafts built into walls that allowed a beam of sunlight to pierce directly down into a dark interior chamber, only on the 2 days of the year when the sun passed directly overhead. This created a dramatic, unmistakable signal that the rains were due to arrive, a critical piece of information for an agricultural society. As the archaeologist Ivan Spraj so brilliantly summarized, these structures were not fortifications but stone computers for timekeeping. They were permanent, unfailing machines that required no moving parts, only the eternal, reliable motion of the heavens. This knowledge was far more than practical. It was the ultimate source of authority. The priestly class who understood these celestial codes held a monopoly on the most vital information in society: when to plant, when to harvest, when to expect the life-giving rains, and when to appease the gods with ceremonies. To the average farmer, this must have seemed like pure magic. The priests could retreat behind their temple walls, observe the stars and the shifting shadows, and then emerge to announce with absolute certainty that the time had come to begin preparations. This ability to seemingly command the seasons elevated them from mere leaders to indispensable intermediaries between humanity and the cosmos. The walls themselves became instruments of this control. A common design feature involved carving specific notches or placing markers along a wall so that the shadow of a nearby peak or standing stone would hit that exact spot on a solstice or equinox. This created a public yet cryptic display. Everyone could see the shadow touch the mark, but only the initiated understood the complex calculations that predicted it. It was a brilliant piece of theater that reinforced the social order, proving that the elites didn't just have military power, they had the universe on their side. This deep integration of architecture and astronomy reveals a world where the earthly and the celestial were not separate realms but a single, interconnected system. A wall was not just a boundary on the ground, it was a line drawn in the sand of time itself, a permanent marker in humanity's attempt to find order and meaning in the vastness of the cosmos. The stones were carefully placed to catch the first light of the winter solstice or to frame the rising of a significant star, turning every sunrise into a ceremony and every passing season into a chapter written in light and shadow. This silent, stone dialogue with the heavens stands as one of the most sophisticated and beautiful applications of ancient engineering, proving that a wall's true purpose was often written not in its defensive strength, but in the precise angles at which it met the sky. But these walls were more than just silent calendars and cold instruments of control. They were also the great canvases of the ancient world, dynamic surfaces where cultures poured out their stories, their beliefs, and their very identities. If we listen closely, we can still hear the echoes of chisels and the whispers of brushes, transforming sheer, functional rock face into the most enduring libraries and galleries humanity has ever known. This was where function and beauty merged, where a king's boast could become a nation's epic, and where a spiritual lesson could be rendered in breathtaking color to inspire awe for centuries. The wall ceased to be a mere barrier and became a storyteller, a teacher, and a priest, ensuring that a culture's most vital narratives would not fade with the memory of a single generation. Nowhere is this fusion of art and authority more striking than in the vast palaces of the Assyrian kings at Nineveh and Nimrud. Walking through these grand complexes, a visitor would have been utterly surrounded, even overwhelmed, by a visual symphony of power carved directly into the limestone wall panels. These were not subtle decorations, they were a form of aggressive, inescapable propaganda. The reliefs depict the king as an unstoppable force of nature, a mighty hunter effortlessly spearing lions, a divine commander leading his invincible army into battle, a merciful ruler receiving tribute from groveling, defeated enemies. Every meticulously carved muscle on his chariot horses, every detailed arrow in a quiver, served a single purpose: to broadcast an image of invincibility and divine favor to any subject, ambassador, or rival noble who entered the hall. The message was simple, direct, and carved in stone for permanence. This king is your protector, your master, and a demigod. cross him at your peril. This art was a psychological weapon designed to quell dissent and foster loyalty through a constant, majestic display of strength that was literally built into the very walls of the state. A world away, in the serene caves of Ajanta in India, walls were used to tell a completely different kind of story, yet with no less power or technical mastery. Here, between the 2nd century BCE and the 5th century CE, Buddhist monks transformed rough cave walls into glowing, ethereal worlds of color and narrative. Using natural pigments and a profound understanding of light and shadow, they created vast murals depicting the past lives of the Buddha, known as Jataka tales. These weren't just pretty pictures, they were sophisticated moral and philosophical lessons rendered in a visual language accessible to everyone, from the most educated scholar to the illiterate farmer who came to pray. A scene showing the Buddha in a previous life as a noble prince giving away his wealth was a silent sermon on the virtue of generosity. Another showing his compassion for a starving tigress and her cubs taught the principle of self-sacrifice. The artists used the curved walls and ceilings of the caves to create a sense of immersion, making the devotee feel as if they were stepping directly into the sacred story. The paintings were an integral part of the spiritual practice, a tool for meditation and instruction that made complex teachings tangible and deeply moving. The wall was not celebrating an earthly king's power, but illustrating a path to enlightenment. This role of the wall as a public educator was absolutely critical in societies where literacy was a rare skill reserved for a privileged few. Before the printing press, how did a ruler communicate his laws? How did a priesthood share its sacred texts? The answer was often written in stone, plaster, and paint for all to see. The most famous example is the Code of Hammurabi, a complete legal code from ancient Babylon, which was inscribed on a towering black diorite stele. While it wasn't part of a city wall, it employed the same principle of permanent public display. It stood in a temple courtyard for everyone to behold, a lasting declaration that justice as defined by the king and the gods was not a secret but a public promise. Similarly, the walls of Egyptian temples were covered in hieroglyphs that detailed everything from royal genealogies and military victories to instructions for rituals and offerings. For the common person, even if they couldn't read the intricate symbols, the sheer scale and grandeur of the inscriptions conveyed the importance and permanence of the messages they contained. The wall became the ultimate authority, an unchangeable record that outlived its authors. The artists themselves were master chemists and engineers, employing sophisticated techniques to make their work last. In places like the Minoan Palace of Knossos on Crete, they applied vibrant frescoes to wet plaster, allowing the pigment to bond chemically with the wall as it dried, creating a stunningly durable finish. The Romans perfected the use of colored stucco, molding it into intricate three-dimensional designs and painting it with brilliant blues from lapis lazuli and rich reds from cinnabar to make their villas and public buildings dazzle. This wasn't just about aesthetics. The choice of expensive, imported materials like Egyptian blue pigment was itself a statement of wealth and global reach. The beauty of the wall was a direct reflection of the power and sophistication of the culture that built it. These artistic endeavors ensured that a pharaoh's name, a Buddha's compassion, or an emperor's glory would endure long after their empires had turned to dust, turning silent stone into the most eloquent and lasting narrator of the human experience. Yet for all their silent, imposing grandeur, these walls were far from mute. They were, in fact, some of the most sophisticated communication networks ever devised in the ancient world, transforming stone and space into a dynamic system for moving information at breathtaking speeds. Imagine the sheer logistical challenge of managing a vast empire without radio, without telegraph, without even a reliable horse-mounted messenger service across treacherous terrain. The solution was ingeniously simple. Use the very architecture of defense as a colossal signaling device, turning a chain of isolated forts into a single, nervous system that could react to danger with the speed of light and the resonance of a struck gong. This was the wall not as a barrier but as a beacon. The most legendary example of this is, without a doubt, the beacon tower system integrated into China's Great Wall. We often picture the wall as a single, unbroken line of stone, but its true power lay in a network of tall, solitary watchtowers positioned within sight of one another, stretching for thousands of miles across mountains and deserts. A guard stationed in one of these towers wasn't just looking for invading armies on the horizon. He was also perpetually watching the tower to his east and the tower to his west. The moment a threat was spotted, a plume of dust signaling a Mongol raiding party, for instance, a precise and incredibly fast sequence would begin. By day, the signal might be a column of smoke, its color or pattern indicating the size and nature of the enemy force. By night, it would be the unmistakable, terrifying glow of a massive fire beacon. One tower would light its signal, and the guard in the next tower would see it and immediately light his own. This chain reaction of light and smoke could race across the empire at over 100 miles per hour, far faster than any horse or runner. A message about an incursion near the western frontier could reach the imperial capital, hundreds of miles away, in a matter of hours, not days or weeks. This allowed for a centralized command to make decisions and dispatch troops with a reaction time that would have seemed like magic to their adversaries. The wall became a living, breathing information highway, its pulse beating with the light of signal fires. But this network wasn't limited to just light. Sound was an equally powerful and more immediate tool for local communication. This is where the mysterious architecture of much older walls comes into play. The massive, so-called Cyclopean walls of Mycenaean citadels in Greece, built from gigantic, irregular stones, are famous for their defensive strength. But their design also had an astonishing acoustic property. The long, narrow, corbelled galleries built within the thickness of the walls, often interpreted as storage areas or secret passages, functioned as perfect sound amplifiers. A sentry could speak in a normal voice at one end of these stone corridors, and their words would be carried with crystal clarity to a guard posted at the far end, even if that was hundreds of feet away. This allowed for silent, secure communication across the entire fortress without shouting from the battlements and alerting a besieging force below. It was a secure, internal intercom system carved directly into the stone over 3,000 years ago. Similarly, the placement of gateways was often engineered to manipulate sound. The deep, narrow entrance passages of Hittite or Bronze Age gates acted like natural megaphones. A warning shout from outside would be funneled and amplified as it traveled through the gate, ensuring the alert was heard loudly and clearly in the courtyard within. Conversely, a commander's orders shouted from inside the gate would be projected outward with greater force and clarity to troops mustering outside the walls. This mastery over sight and sound created a layered communication strategy. Elevated walkways along the tops of walls, like those on the walls of Constantinople or York, provided a high vantage point not just for seeing enemies, but for sending complex visual signals with flags or polished shields that could reflect sunlight in coded patterns. These signals could coordinate the movements of defenders along the wall's length, direct reserves to a breach, or communicate with ships in a harbor below. This system transformed a static defensive line into a responsive, intelligent organism. A commander in a central tower could see the entire battle through the signals relayed from distant towers and direct his forces accordingly by sending his own signals back along the line. The wall was the command and control center, the observation post, and the signal station all fused into one incredible structure. This ability to gather information and issue commands rapidly was a force multiplier far more significant than the sheer height of the stones. It meant that a smaller defending force could hold a much longer wall because they could concentrate their strength exactly where it was needed at the exact right time. The wall didn't just add muscle to a defense, it gave it a brain and a voice, proving that in ancient warfare, information wasn't just power, it was survival. This incredible ingenuity in harnessing the environment for communication finds a parallel in how these same structures were designed to work in harmony with the natural world for a completely different purpose, not to send messages but to manage the very elements themselves. This incredible ingenuity in harnessing the environment for communication finds a parallel in how these same structures were designed to work in harmony with the natural world for a completely different purpose, not to send messages but to manage the very elements themselves. We've seen walls as economic tools, social diagrams, and celestial calculators, but perhaps one of their most overlooked roles was as sophisticated climate control systems. Ancient builders were master eco-engineers long before the term existed, and they understood that a wall's relationship with the wind, sun, and water could be just as critical to a city's survival as its relationship with any invading army. They didn't just build on the land, they built with it, crafting structures that turned harsh, unforgiving environments into livable, even thriving habitats. Consider the breathtaking city of Petra, carved directly into the rose-red cliffs of southern Jordan. In this arid desert landscape, the relentless sun and scorching temperatures were a constant threat. The Nabateans, the city's brilliant architects, didn't just carve tombs and temples, they designed an entire urban environment that was a masterpiece of passive cooling. The narrow, winding canyon known as the Siq that serves as the main entrance to Petra does more than just create a dramatic approach, it functions as a natural wind tunnel. The high, close walls of the Siq shade the pathway from the direct sun for most of the day, creating a significantly cooler microclimate, but the genius goes deeper. The specific orientation and textured surfaces of these rock walls were designed to channel and accelerate any faint desert breeze, creating a natural air conditioning system that would funnel cooling air into the city center. The buildings themselves, carved into the cliff faces, used the immense thermal mass of the stone to their advantage. The rock absorbed the heat of the day, keeping the interiors cool, and then slowly released it during the cold desert night, moderating the extreme temperature swing. The walls weren't just there, they were actively working to make life possible. This principle of using mass to regulate temperature was flipped on its head in colder climates. In the high-altitude regions of the Andes, the Inca and their predecessors faced a different challenge, a bitter cold and piercing winds. Their solution was just as ingenious. They constructed massive, double-walled enclosures where the gap between the two walls was often filled with rubble or soil. This created a thick, insulating barrier that trapped heat inside living spaces and blocked the icy winds. Furthermore, they often strategically placed their settlements and built terraced walls to maximize exposure to the low-angled sun during the day, soaking up every bit of precious solar warmth. In parts of ancient Europe, similar principles were at work. The thick stone walls of medieval castles and farmhouses, often several feet deep, acted as heat sinks. They would absorb warmth from fires and body heat during the day, preventing the interior from overheating, and then slowly radiate that stored heat back into the room as temperatures dropped at night. creating a stable and far more comfortable environment than the fluctuating conditions outside. A wall, in this context, became a thermal battery. Perhaps the most vital environmental adaptation, however, was the management of water. In many ancient cities, walls were integral parts of the water supply and drainage infrastructure. The famous walls of Constantinople, for instance, incorporated massive underground cisterns like the Basilica cistern, which stored hundreds of thousands of gallons of freshwater brought in by aqueducts. These reserves, protected within the city's fortified shell, were the key to surviving prolonged sieges. But it wasn't just about storage, it was about control. The elaborate terracing walls built by the Inca on the steep slopes of the Andes are a stunning example of landscape-scale hydro-engineering. These walls did more than just create flat land for agriculture. They dramatically slowed down the destructive force of heavy rainfall, preventing catastrophic soil erosion and allowing water to percolate slowly into the ground instead of washing everything away. They created a series of microclimates on each terrace, each with its own slightly different temperature and humidity level, allowing for a diverse range of crops to be cultivated at high altitude. In this way, the walls didn't just defend the people, they defended the very land that fed them. This deep, symbiotic relationship between wall and environment reveals a level of sophistication that we are only now fully appreciating with our modern focus on sustainable design. These ancient builders possessed a profound understanding of their local climate, geology, and hydrology. They saw a wall not as an isolated object, but as an element to be integrated into a complex system. It could be a wind catcher, a shade maker, a heat store, a water channel, and an earth holder. This multifaceted approach to environmental control shows that the ultimate goal of these structures was resilience. They were built to create a stable, sustainable, and secure existence in a world full of natural and human threats. The wall was the ultimate tool of adaptation, proving that true strength lay not in dominating nature, but in working with it to build a lasting refuge. This harmonious relationship between powerful architecture and the natural world provided a stable foundation upon which another, more abstract form of power could be constructed and displayed for all to see. Yet this harmonious adaptation to the natural world was often paired with a far more calculated human ambition, the raw, unyielding projection of political power. If a wall could command the wind and the water, it could certainly be used to command the loyalty and fear of a population. Beyond their practical and environmental roles, these monumental structures became the ultimate stage for political propaganda, a permanent, immovable billboard upon which rulers could chisel their legitimacy for all eternity. This was power made visible, a psychological conquest achieved not with the sword, but with the sheer, overwhelming presence of stone and symbol. Perhaps the most audacious example of this is not a city wall, but a cliff face. High on the side of a mountain along the ancient road between Babylon and Ecbatana in modern-day Iran, King Darius I of Persia commissioned a masterpiece of political messaging known as the Behistun inscription. This was no simple graffito. It was a massive, multifaceted relief carved into a near-vertical rock wall, utterly inaccessible, ensuring that it could not be altered or defaced. The scene depicts Darius larger than life, with his foot placed triumphantly on the chest of a rival pretender to the throne. Behind him stand two of his loyal soldiers, and before him, a line of 9 defeated rebel kings, bound and roped at the neck. But the true genius of this propaganda lies in the text. The same story of Darius's righteous victory and his divine appointment by the god Ahura Mazda is painstakingly carved in 3 different languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate act of communication aimed at every corner of his vast multicultural empire. Any diplomat, merchant, or official traveling that important road would have to stop and look up. They would see the image of their powerful king subduing his enemies, and they would be able to read his boastful proclamation in their own tongue. The message was unequivocal. Resistance is futile, my authority is divinely sanctioned, and this record of my power is as permanent as the mountain itself. The wall here was not a barrier but an amplifier, projecting the voice of the king across time and space. The Romans, masters of statecraft, understood this principle intimately. While their famous walls, like the Aurelian walls in Rome, were formidable defensive structures, they were also canvases for a constant stream of political communication. The gates and central sections of these walls were often adorned with inscribed marble plaques announcing the emperor who had commissioned their construction or repair. These were not humble credits, they were boastful proclamations. An inscription might declare that the emperor, by the grace of the gods, had restored the walls of the city for the safety of the Roman people. This served multiple purposes. It associated the ruler directly with the public good and the physical security of every citizen. It reminded everyone that their safety was a gift from the emperor, fostering a sense of dependence and gratitude. And it created a lasting legacy long after that emperor was gone. His name would remain etched into the most visible and vital structure in the city, forever associating him with strength, providence, and permanence. It was a brilliant piece of political advertising paid for with public funds, ensuring the emperor's brand of power was inescapable. This use of scale for psychological effect cannot be overstated. The sheer, mind-bending size of a massive wall was itself a form of propaganda. To a peasant farmer approaching a city like Babylon, the sight of walls reputed to be so thick that chariots could race along their top was meant to inspire a sense of awe and utter futility. The scale of the project communicated the unimaginable resources and organizational power of the ruler who commanded it. It whispered a terrifying question. If a king can move mountains to build such a thing, what chance do you possibly have of opposing him? This awe was carefully cultivated through design. Gates were often flanked by colossal statues of protective deities or fearsome creatures like Lamassu, winged bulls with human heads, that served both a spiritual and an intimating function. The walls themselves might be decorated with repeating symbols of royal power, the stripes of a certain dynasty, the repeated image of a sacred animal, or the carved likeness of the king himself. Every brick, in a way, was a vote of confidence in the regime. Finally, walls provided the perfect, permanent backdrop for the theater of state. Public ceremonies, triumphal processions, and the reception of foreign ambassadors were almost always staged in relation to the city's main gates and walls. A victorious general would lead his army and his captives through a specific, decorated gate in a grand parade. The emperor would address the crowds from a platform built into the wall, standing literally above them, framed by the symbols of his authority. The wall was not just a setting for these events, it was an active participant providing the gravitas, the symbolism, and the security that made the spectacle so potent. It reinforced the social order by providing a stage where power relationships were constantly performed and reaffirmed. This subtle but constant psychological warfare, waged in stone and ceremony, often did more to secure a ruler's grip on power than any legion of soldiers, proving that the most enduring conquests are those that happen in the minds of a people. And yet, for all their use in projecting an image of impenetrable sovereignty, these very same walls also contained gateways that were deliberately opened, not to conquer, but to connect and converse with the wider world. Yet for all their imposing might and psychological intimidation, these same walls contained a beautiful and often overlooked paradox. The very gates designed to be slammed shut against an enemy army were also, at different times, thrown wide open as portals for peace, curiosity, and commerce. Far from being the iron curtains of the ancient world, the most successful walls functioned as sophisticated filters, not to stop all interaction, but to carefully manage it, transforming themselves from symbols of isolation into dynamic engines of cultural exchange. The gate was not just a barrier, it was a turnstile between worlds, a place where ideas, art, and beliefs could flow as freely as goods, provided one had the right credentials and peaceful intentions. Nowhere was this role as a diplomatic reception hall more grandly displayed than at the gates of Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire. The city's legendary Theodosian walls were the strongest defensive system of the medieval world, a multi-layered masterpiece of ditches, outer walls, and towering inner fortifications. But their primary gate, the Golden Gate, was far more than a military checkpoint. This triumphal arch of gleaming white marble, flanked by massive towers and capped with statues, was reserved for one purpose: the ceremonial welcome of foreign dignitaries. When an ambassador from Persia, a trade delegation from Venice, or envoys from the steppes of Central Asia approached, they did not enter through some cramped, fortified side entrance. They were ushered through this breathtaking monument. The message was immediate and undeniable. The empire was confident, wealthy, and powerful enough to not only defend itself but to engage with the world on its own terms. The procession of these foreign parties through the city's main thoroughfares, witnessed by its diverse populace, was a public spectacle of diplomacy. It showcased the empire's global connections and its role as a crossroads of civilization, all while firmly establishing the protocol and hierarchy of these interactions. The wall, in this context, provided the secure framework that made such open, confident diplomacy possible. This function was replicated on a continental scale along the greatest network of cultural exchange in history, the Silk Road. The idea of the Great Wall of China as a solitary, impregnable barrier is a dramatic oversimplification. For much of its history, it was less a solid wall and more a connected series of fortified passes and garrisoned oases. At critical junctures, these fortifications housed and protected sprawling caravanserais, walled inns that offered sanctuary to the endless stream of merchants, monks, and pilgrims traversing the deserts and mountains. Within these secure compounds, a Sogdian trader from Samarkand could share a meal with a Chinese official. A Buddhist monk from India could debate theology with a Nestorian Christian from Persia, and an Aigha musician could teach a new melody to a Turkish horseman. The walls of the caravanserai did not create this exchange, but they made it sustainable. They provided the safety necessary for weary travelers to let their guard down, to rest, and most importantly, to talk. They were the neutral, secure conference rooms of the ancient world, where the real business of cultural fusion, the sharing of languages, technologies, religious ideas, and artistic styles, could take place, protected from the bandits and the harsh elements outside. The wall guaranteed the peace required for this profound interaction to occur. This spirit of managed inclusivity is literally carved in stone at numerous ancient sites. The most famous example is again the Behistun inscription in Iran, but for a different reason. By having King Darius's proclamation of victory written in 3 distinct languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, the Persian Empire was doing something revolutionary. It was acknowledging the multilingual, multicultural nature of its vast territory. It was a declaration that the state's authority was not just for one people, but for all within its borders, and that it would communicate with them in a way they could understand. This practice of multilingual inscriptions on gates and monuments was a powerful tool of integration. It told conquered peoples that their identity was not being entirely erased, but rather incorporated into a larger whole. Similarly, the physical architecture of walls often tells a story of fusion. When the Romans conquered a new territory, they didn't always tear down the old walls and build entirely new ones in a purely Roman style. They frequently incorporated local construction techniques, creating a hybrid architecture that reflected the new blended reality of the province. A gate in Roman Gaul might have the classic Roman arch but be decorated with local Celtic artistic motifs. This wasn't just practical, it was a subtle form of political messaging, showing that the Roman world was a synthesis of many cultures, all protected under the umbrella of its military might. Perhaps the most poignant evidence of walls as bridges are the peace treaties and formal agreements that were sometimes physically inscribed upon them. While less common than boasts of victory, there are instances where the terms of a truce, a trade agreement, or a formal alliance between two powers were carved into a gatepost or a specially commissioned stone panel set into a city wall. This act transformed the wall from a symbol of division into a permanent, public record of cooperation. It made the terms of the agreement visible to all, a constant reminder of the covenant that existed between former adversaries. It elevated the wall's function from the purely military to the diplomatic and legal, anchoring a fragile peace in the most solid, immovable object the ancients could create, stone. This incredible duality, the wall as both weapon and welcome mat, as defender and diplomat, shows the breathtaking sophistication of ancient statecraft. It proves that true strength lay not in cowering behind a barrier, but in having the confidence to control who you let in and on what terms, using the very structure that kept your enemies out to usher new friends, new ideas, and new prosperity into the heart of your civilization. But the true mastery of this psychological warfare lay not just in the reality of the walls, but in the carefully cultivated myths and illusions that grew around them. Ancient architects were keenly aware of visual perception and employed clever tricks to make their fortifications appear even more formidable than they actually were. The approach to a city gate was often designed as a long, narrow corridor that forced any attacking force into a tightly packed column, making their numbers seem insignificant against the looming battlements ahead. The bases of walls were frequently built with a pronounced outward slope, a feature called a batter, which not only deflected siege rams but also created an optical illusion from the ground, making the wall appear impossibly thick and steep. The use of massive, rusticated stones, those with rough, unfinished edges, at the base of walls, particularly in Mycenaean and Etruscan architecture, was a deliberate choice. It made the construction look primordial, as if it had been built by giants or gods, and therefore utterly unmovable by mortal hands. This was architecture designed to crush morale before a single arrow was ever knocked. The propaganda machine would then work tirelessly to amplify this intimidating image. Rulers and their chroniclers actively spread exaggerated tales of their walls' invincibility to every corner of the known world. The Greek historian Herodotus, though often a reliable source, may have fallen for this very propaganda when he famously described the walls of Babylon. He claimed they were so wide that a 4-horse chariot could be driven along the top, and that their height was beyond belief. Whether entirely accurate or not, this was the story the Babylonians wanted told. It was a narrative weapon designed to make potential enemies reconsider the cost of an attack before they even began their march. Similarly, the Romans were masters of this information war. News of a rebellious tribe being crushed behind the safety of a frontier wall like Hadrian's would be broadcast far and wide, serving as a stark warning to any other would-be challengers. The message was clear: behind these stones we are untouchable, and your rebellion is futile. Perhaps the most chilling and direct form of psychological deterrence was the use of grim trophies adorning the battlements. Across many cultures, from the Assyrians to the medieval Europeans, the tops of walls and gates were used as a public display case for the consequences of defiance. The impaled heads of defeated enemies, the decaying bodies of executed criminals, or the skulls of rival chiefs mounted on spikes were not merely the result of battle rage. They were a calculated, horrific form of communication. For a visiting ambassador, it was a warning about the fate of those who crossed the state. For a local population, it was a terrifying reminder of the power that protected them and the brutal price of disloyalty. And for an approaching army, it was the first thing they would see, a grisly preview of their own potential fate. This transformed the wall from a passive barrier into an active, threatening presence, screaming a message of death without uttering a single word. This focus on the mind over sheer muscle had a profound strategic benefit. It was incredibly cost-effective. Maintaining a large standing army to patrol a vast frontier was ruinously expensive. But a well-designed wall, bolstered by a fearsome reputation, could achieve a similar deterrent effect for a fraction of the price. It allowed a kingdom to project power far beyond its actual military reach. A distant nomadic chieftain, hearing whispered tales of an impregnable wall manned by invincible soldiers and guarded by dark spirits, might decide to raid a softer target instead. The wall, therefore, didn't just defend the border. It extended a sphere of psychological influence that could keep enemies paralyzed with indecision and fear hundreds of miles away. This saved immense resources, prevented bloodshed, and secured peace, proving that the most successful defense is often the battle that never has to be fought because the enemy's spirit was already broken by a story, an illusion, and the sheer, terrifying majesty of stone. This function of psychological deterrence, so focused on perception and control, finds a fascinating parallel in a far more practical and grounded application of walled boundaries, the very framework of law and administration. If a wall could shape the mind of an enemy, it could certainly shape the behavior of a citizen. Beyond defense and intimidation, these structures became the physical backbone of ancient legal systems, the immutable lines on the map that dictated everything from taxation and trade rights to personal liberty and property ownership. In a world without digital databases or easily accessible written records, the wall provided the most unambiguous and permanent marker of jurisdiction imaginable. It was the ultimate authority rendered in stone. The brilliant and strategic use of the long walls in ancient Athens offers a perfect case study in this legal engineering. These fortified corridors, connecting the city-state to its vital ports at Piraeus and Phalerum, were far more than just protected supply routes during wartime. In times of peace, they functioned as a legally distinct space, a sovereign tunnel through the Attic countryside. The moment a merchant passed through the gate at Piraeus and stepped onto the road between the long walls, they were no longer under the general laws of the land, but subject to a specific set of commercial and customs regulations enforced by Athenian officials. This created a secure and highly regulated economic corridor where goods could be moved, taxed, and monitored with maximum efficiency. The walls physically prevented smuggling by land, funneling all traffic through controlled checkpoints. They established a clear legal boundary where the powerful Athenian navy's authority began, even before reaching the sea. This wasn't just a wall, it was a legislative instrument, a physical law that dictated the terms of trade and reinforced state control over the city's economic lifeblood. This concept of the wall defining a unique legal zone exploded across medieval Europe with the proliferation of walled towns and their coveted charters. To step through a gate into a medieval town like Bruges, York, or Siena was to cross into a world with a completely different set of rules than the feudal countryside left behind. The town walls marked the exact line where the complex web of obligations to a rural lord ended and the privileges and laws of urban citizenship began. Within those walls, a man could be free, a burgher with rights to trade, to own property, and to participate in a measure of self-governance through guilds and town councils. The walls were the physical embodiment of that hard-won autonomy. Town charters which granted these rights were often read aloud and ceremonially posted at the main gate, making the entranceway itself a symbol of the law. Furthermore, the walls created a defined space for the town's own legal authorities to hold sway. Town guards patrolled the ramparts and gates, enforcing local ordinances on everything from market hours and sanitation to curfews. Disputes between citizens were adjudicated in courts inside the walls under urban law. The wall didn't just keep the bad out, it kept the legal order in. The enforcement of this order was concentrated at the most dynamic point of any wall, its gates. These were the natural choke points for administrative control. It was here that customs officials set up their tables to collect tolls and taxes on every cartload of goods entering the city. A specific gate might even be dedicated to a certain type of trade, a livestock gate, a grain gate allowing for specialized monitoring and taxation. But the gate's role went beyond revenue. It was also the primary site for the proclamation of new laws and official announcements. A herald would stand before the gate, where traffic was busiest, and read out decrees from the ruling council or monarch, ensuring the news reached both those entering and those leaving. The gate was the community's bulletin board and news station. In a very literal sense, it was also a boundary marker for property disputes. The exact line of the town wall was often used in legal documents to settle arguments over land on the urban fringe, its massive, unchanging presence providing an indisputable reference point that everyone could see and agree upon. This intricate legal framework, made solid and visible by walls, brought a crucial layer of order to increasingly complex societies. It provided clarity and certainty. A merchant knew the exact point where a tariff needed to be paid. A farmer knew the line where feudal duties ended. A criminal knew that crossing the wall might place them beyond the reach of one authority and into the hands of another. The wall structured daily life not through fear, but through predictable, organized systems of governance. It created manageable units of administration, allowing for the efficient collection of taxes, the raising of militias, and the census of populations. This organizational genius, so vital for the smooth functioning of a state, highlights yet another layer of the wall's multifaceted purpose. It was the ultimate tool for bringing human chaos into a manageable, orderly system, proving that the law in the ancient world needed not just a voice but a formidable physical presence. While the psychological and legal power of walls shaped human society, their most fundamental and often overlooked role was as a literal shield against the raw, unforgiving power of nature. Beyond the threat of human enemies, ancient civilizations faced a constant, terrifying onslaught from their environment, devastating floods that could erase seasons of work in hours, earthquakes that could topple entire cities, and wildfires that could consume homes in moments. In the face of these existential dangers, the wall was reinvented not as a symbol of power, but as a tool of pure, ingenious survival. This was civil engineering in its most vital form, a desperate and brilliant collaboration with the elements to carve out a safe space for life to continue. The story of this struggle is written into the very foundations of one of the world's first great urban cultures, the Indus Valley civilization. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were marvels of planning. but their existence in the fertile yet volatile floodplain of the Indus River was a constant gamble. The solution was a masterpiece of hydroengineering. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of massive, thick embankment walls and raised platforms that surrounded and underpinned these cities. These weren't designed to stop armies, they were designed to stop water. During the annual monsoon season, when the Indus would swell and threaten to burst its banks, these colossal earthwork barriers acted as a buffer, diverting the floodwaters and channeling them away from the densely packed streets and meticulously built brick houses. Furthermore, the entire city was built on an artificial mound, elevated above the surrounding plain, with the defensive walls serving a dual purpose as retaining structures for this built-up foundation. This integrated system turned a vulnerable settlement into a lifeboat, ensuring that when the waters rose, the heart of the city, its people, its granaries, its administrative centers, would remain high and dry. The wall here was the difference between a manageable inconvenience and a catastrophic wipeout. This battle against flooding was perfected over millennia in China, along the tempestuous Yellow River, known poetically and accurately as China's Sorrow for its history of catastrophic floods. The Chinese response was not just to build walls against the river, but to build an entire landscape of control. They constructed elaborate systems of levees and dikes, essentially long, continuous walls of packed earth that stretched for hundreds of miles to contain the river's flow. But their genius lay in the details. These walls weren't solid, impermeable barriers that would only cause pressure to build up until they catastrophically failed. Instead, they were designed with intentional, reinforced spillways and integrated drainage systems. In times of extreme flood, these controlled outlets could be opened to divert water into secondary channels or designated floodplains, sacrificing less critical areas to save major population centers downstream. This was a sophisticated understanding of pressure management and strategic release, a concept that modern civil engineering still employs. The maintenance and reinforcement of these great walls against water were considered a primary duty of the emperor, a sacred responsibility to protect his people from nature's wrath. A dynasty's legitimacy could literally rise and fall with the level of the river. The innovative spirit of ancient builders extended far beyond water. In regions plagued by earthquakes like Anatolia and parts of the Mediterranean, masons developed incredible techniques to make their walls dance with the earth rather than fight it. The mighty Cyclopean walls of Mycenae in Greece, built from gigantic, irregular limestone boulders, are a stunning example. Rather than using small, uniform bricks that would shatter under stress, they used these massive, polygonal stones. Their irregular shapes interlocked with each other like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. During an earthquake, this design allowed for a degree of flexibility. The stones could shift and grind against each other, absorbing and dissipating the seismic energy throughout the entire structure. Instead of cracking along a straight, weak mortar line, the force was distributed, and when the shaking stopped, the sheer weight and friction of the stones would often settle them back into a stable position. This was passive seismic damping in stone, a technology developed over 3,000 years ago that allowed these citadels to stand for millennia in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. For cities built primarily of wood, like those in medieval Japan and Northern Europe, the ever-present threat was not earth or water, but fire. A single cooking accident or lightning strike could unleash an inferno that would race through tightly packed neighborhoods. Once again, the wall was adapted as a fire break. Wealthy districts and critical structures like castles and storehouses were often encircled by high, blank stone walls. These barriers had a clear defensive purpose, but they also served a vital civic function. If a fire broke out in the outer city, these inner walls could contain the blaze, preventing it from jumping to the most valuable parts of the city. In some Japanese castles, vast, empty plazas and graveled courtyards were strategically placed between different wooden sections of the complex, creating fire breaks that starving flames could not cross. In arid and desert regions, walls took on another role, shielding against the wind. Thick, high walls were built around oasis settlements to block the relentless, abrasive sandstorms, protecting delicate irrigation canals from being filled with dust and creating a calmer, more humid microclimate for agriculture within their embrace. From holding back rivers to weathering quakes and starving fires, these ancient walls stand as a powerful testament to human resilience, proving that our ancestors' greatest constructions were often not about making war, but about securing peace, a durable, hard-won sanctuary from the unpredictable violence of the natural world. And so, while these walls shielded civilizations from the elements, they performed an even more vital service for the future. They refused to let time erase the past. In an age before paper, hard drives, or cloud storage, the most permanent canvas for a society's memory was the very stone it built with. Walls were transformed into vast, open-air archives, their surfaces deliberately etched with the stories, triumphs, and even the warnings that a culture deemed too precious to be lost. This was history set in stone, a direct line of communication from the ancients to us, ensuring their identity and their experiences would echo across the centuries. The most iconic practitioners of this art were undoubtedly the ancient Egyptians. To walk through the hypostyle hall of Karnak or the inner sanctums of Abydos is to be surrounded by a comprehensive historical record. Every column, every lintel, every square inch of wall space is a meticulously carved chronicle. These are not random decorations, they are official state documents. They depict specific pharaohs, a Ramses or a Thutmose, making offerings to the gods, smiting foreign enemies in precise military campaigns, and presiding over sacred rituals. The accompanying hieroglyphs don't just label the scenes, they provide dates, names, and boastful narratives of the king's divine right to rule. This was history as propaganda, yes, but it was also history as a sacred duty. By inscribing these events into the fabric of their most enduring temples, the Egyptians believed they were making them eternally true and effective in the eyes of the gods, securing cosmic order and the legacy of their ruler for all time. These walls became the ultimate authority, a stone library where a priest or official could literally point to a carved image to verify a historical claim or a royal lineage. On another continent, the Maya developed a parallel tradition with their own unique flourish, the stelae. These were tall, freestanding stone monoliths, often arranged in plazas like a forest of history. But to call them simple monuments is to underestimate their purpose. Each stela was a densely packed information storage device. Using their incredibly complex and precise calendar system, the Maya inscribed these slabs with exact dates, often marking the end of a 20-year period called a Kayatun, to record the ascensions, marriages, military victories, and deaths of their rulers. A powerful king would commission a series of stelae, creating a dynastic history that would outlive him. But the Maya went even further, connecting human history directly to the cosmos. Many stelae also record astronomical events, like the path of Venus or a solar eclipse, that occurred during a ruler's reign. This created a powerful link between the king's actions and the movements of the gods in the heavens, weaving the historical record into the very fabric of the universe. These stone walls, standing upright under the open sky, were textbooks, royal chronicles, and astronomical almanacs all fused into one. This urge to preserve vital information for future generations extended beyond the boasts of kings to include stark, practical warnings. In Mesopotamia, a land perpetually at the mercy of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, some wall inscriptions served as ancient emergency broadcasts. Archaeologists have found cuneiform texts inscribed on temple walls that detail severe, multi-year droughts and the famines that followed. These were not merely historical curiosities, they were desperate memos to the future. By recording the scale of the catastrophe and the often failed attempts to mitigate it, the scribes were creating a permanent record. The message to any future ruler who could read the signs was clear. See how bad it can get, see what we endured, let our suffering inform your preparations. It was a form of collective memory hardwired into the city's architecture, meant to build resilience across generations. The Romans, masters of political messaging, took this concept and erected it to glorious, overwhelming heights, literally. Trajan's Column in Rome is perhaps the most elaborate historical archive ever carved from stone. Wrapping around the 126-foot-tall column is a continuous, spiraling narrative frieze that tells the story of Emperor Trajan's successful military campaigns against the Dacians in exquisite cinematic detail. It shows everything from the construction of forts and the movement of armies to battles and the eventual surrender of the enemy. It functions less like a book and more like a 200-meter-long stone film reel, designed to be walked around and read from bottom to top. This was public history on a monumental scale, ensuring that every citizen, regardless of literacy, could witness the emperor's power and the empire's might. It was a permanent, unignorable record of victory designed to cement Trajan's legacy in the very skyline of the city. On a much more intimate scale, this practice of etching history into walls extended to the family unit. Across the ancient world, from the patrician homes of Rome to the clan compounds of Scotland, it was common to find genealogies and the achievements of ancestors carved into interior walls or commemorative plaques in the atrium. This was more than simple pride, it was a legal and social necessity. Proving your lineage was often required to claim inheritance, assert political office, or maintain social status. The family wall became a curated archive, a stone-certified resume that demonstrated your place in a long and respected line. It rooted a family's present-day identity in the documented deeds of its past, creating a powerful sense of continuity and obligation. In this way, the grandest temple wall and the humblest home shared a common purpose: to defy oblivion, to tell the story of who they were, and to whisper across the ages, "We were here." Yet this remarkable legacy of preservation, of saving stories from the sands of time, was only possible because of an equally profound legacy of creation. To etch a history into a wall that would last millennia, you first had to build a wall that could defy millennia. This challenged the sheer, audacious physics of stacking stone upon stone to impossible heights and daunting lengths, pushed ancient engineers to the very limits of their ingenuity. The construction of walls became the great crucible of architectural innovation, a forcing ground for new materials, new mathematics, and new forms that would eventually reshape the entire world, leaving a hidden blueprint in everything from our modern skyscrapers to the bridges we cross without a second thought. The Romans, in their relentless drive for order and permanence, didn't just build walls, they revolutionized the very substance from which they were made. While others were quarrying and carving, Roman engineers were mixing and pouring. Their secret weapon was opus caementitium, Roman concrete. This was no simple mud and straw mixture. It was a sophisticated recipe of lime, volcanic ash from Pozzuoli, and aggregate that possessed a near magical property. It actually got stronger over time, especially when exposed to water. This meant that their walls, like those of the Aurelian walls in Rome or the fortifications of countless frontier towns, could be built faster, higher, and in almost any shape imaginable. They could cast immense curved curtain walls that distributed stress more effectively than straight lines. They could build hollow walls and fill the cavity with this rubble and concrete mix, creating structures that were both massive and surprisingly economical. This chemical innovation gave their empire its bony structure, allowing them to stamp a permanent, imposing Roman presence across 3 continents. The longevity of their walls is a direct testament to this material science. Where many contemporary structures have crumbled to dust, Roman concrete walls still stand, hard as iron, 2,000 years later. On the other side of the globe, facing a completely different set of geological challenges, the Inca of the Andes achieved a similar miracle of endurance through an opposite approach, absolute precision instead of fluid fusion. In the heart of their empire, at sites like Sacsayhuaman above Cusco or the terraces of Ollantaytambo, they constructed walls using a technique known as polygonal masonry. The concept is mind-bogglingly simple and impossibly difficult. Imagine a gigantic, 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle where every single piece is an irregularly shaped boulder weighing several tons. The Inca stonemasons would painstakingly quarry these stones, and then, through a process we still don't fully understand, they would shape them so that each one fit perfectly against its neighbors without a single drop of mortar. The joints are so tight that even a razor blade cannot be inserted between the stones. This wasn't just for show, it was genius seismic engineering. When an earthquake strikes, a rigid, mortared wall will crack and collapse. But an Inca wall, with its interlocking stones and flexible joints, actually dances. The stones shift and settle against each other, absorbing and dissipating the tremendous energy, and when the shaking stops, they simply settle back into place. They built not for rigidity, but for resilience, creating structures that have withstood centuries of violent earthquakes that have flattened modern buildings around them. These grand material innovations were matched by a constant evolution in form and feature, each one a direct response to the brutal logic of siege warfare. The classic silhouette of a castle battlement with its alternating high teeth and low gaps is called a crenellation. This was not a decorative choice, it was a life-saving piece of design. The raised merlons provided a solid shield for a defender to hide behind while reloading a crossbow or drawing a bowstring. The lower embrasures allowed them to step forward and fire or pour something unpleasant on the attackers below, all while minimizing their exposure. This simple rhythm of stone gave defenders a critical tactical advantage. Similarly, the introduction of the arch was a revolution in structural integrity. A simple lintel, a flat stone or beam over a doorway, has a critical weakness: too much weight above it and it will snap. But an arch, whether rounded like the Romans perfected or pointed like the Goths later developed, redirects the immense weight of the wall above it down through the curve and into the supporting pillars on either side. This meant gateways could be made wider and stronger, and tunnels could be dug through the base of walls for sally ports without compromising the entire structure's stability. Even the very base of a wall was a site of innovation. The pronounced outward slope at the bottom of many walls, known as a batter, served a dual purpose. It made the wall mechanically more stable, like the splayed feet of a tripod, and it also created a deadly surface for defenders. Stones or heavy objects dropped from the top would hit this slope and ricochet violently outward into the attacking force, rather than landing neatly at the wall's base. The ripple effects of these ancient experiments in stone and stress are all around us, hidden in plain sight. The same principles of load distribution that the Romans mastered with the arch are the bedrock of every major bridge and cathedral built in the last 1,000 years, and are fundamentally the reason our modern skyscrapers can scrape the sky. The use of a strong, poured core within a more decorative facing, a standard Roman technique, is directly analogous to the steel girders and concrete cores inside the glass facades of contemporary high-rises. The Incas' understanding of flexible, jointed structures to withstand dynamic forces informs modern earthquake-resistant engineering. We are still building on the breakthroughs they achieved out of sheer necessity, their ancient solutions encoded into the DNA of our modern world. This relentless drive to build higher, stronger, and smarter was never just about keeping people out. It was about reaching for new possibilities, solving impossible problems, and leaving a mark on the world that could not be easily erased. This architectural revolution, born from the need for defense, ultimately provided the essential toolkit for building the complex, interconnected urban landscapes we live in today. But the true genius of these urban walls was not just in the grand outline they drew around a city. It was in the intricate, deliberate way they shaped the life that flourished within them. Think of a walled city not as a sealed container, but as a carefully designed ecosystem, a living machine where every district, every street, and every building had a purpose dictated by the logic of security and community. The wall was the ultimate tool for urban zoning, long before the term was ever coined by a modern planner. It created a powerful incentive to organize space with ruthless efficiency, leading to some of the most distinctive and functional cityscapes in human history. The chaotic, organic sprawl of a modern suburb would have been unthinkable and strategically suicidal within the precious, protected space inside the fortifications. This organizational impulse is brilliantly illustrated in the layout of a classic medieval European town. The need to house a growing population within a limited, defensible area led to a fascinating radial street pattern that still defines the charm of cities like Bruges, Carcassonne, and Siena to this day. The widest, most important streets would lead directly from the main gates to the central marketplace and the town church. This wasn't just for aesthetic symmetry, it was a design for rapid military response. In the event of an attack, reinforcements could be rushed from the central mustering point straight to any threatened gate along these wide, direct arteries. Meanwhile, a tangled web of narrower, winding alleys branched off these main thoroughfares. These lanes were not a design flaw, they were a defensive feature in themselves, creating a maze that would confuse and slow down any enemy who managed to breach the outer walls, turning the city itself into a final, deadly trap for invaders. Within this organized shell, a strict social and economic geography took root. Specific trades and crafts were often clustered together in dedicated quarters, their locations dictated by practicality and sometimes even smell. The street of the butchers, the quarter of the tanners, these were typically placed downwind from the more affluent residential areas and close to a water source for their messy and odorous work. The metalworkers, the blacksmiths and armorers would be situated near the main arsenal or a major gate, ensuring their critical products were readily available to the defenders. The wealthiest merchants and the noble families would often live in the most protected zone, close to the central citadel or main square, while the humbler homes of laborers were pushed closer to the periphery, nearer the walls they were expected to help defend. This wasn't a random accident, it was a meticulously planned social hierarchy made physical, with your address within the walls speaking volumes about your status and role in the urban organism. And at the very heart of this walled world lay its true civic soul, the public square. In a Greek city-state, this was the agora, a bustling open space encircled by colonnades, temples, and government buildings. In a medieval town, it was the marketplace, dominated by the imposing town hall and the soaring cathedral spire. This central plaza was the vital lung of the city, the one place where all its diverse inhabitants could come together. It was where politics happened, where goods were exchanged, where news was gossiped, and where justice was publicly administered. The wall made this space possible by guaranteeing its security. It allowed for the creation of a permanent, unprotected open area at the city's core, a luxury that would be unimaginable in an undefended settlement vulnerable to a sudden raid. This safe, common ground was where a shared civic identity was forged. A farmer from the surrounding countryside, once he passed through the gate and entered this main square, was no longer just a peasant. He was, in some small way, a citizen of something larger, participating in the economic and social life of the polis or the burg. The wall didn't just protect the people, it protected the very idea of the city itself, fostering a powerful sense of local patriotism and belonging that could be as fierce as any national identity today. This profound connection between a people and their protected place would become a powerful, often explosive, force in the rivalries that shaped the ancient and medieval worlds. But the true genius of these organized cities was not just in their layout, but in their hidden, beating heart, the vast and vital reserves of life-sustaining resources that were ingeniously woven into the very fabric of their defenses. A city under siege was a city under a death sentence, its fate sealed not by the strength of its enemy's army, but by its own dwindling supplies of food and water. Ancient engineers understood this brutal calculus intimately, and so they transformed their mighty walls from simple barriers into the most sophisticated storage and distribution networks the world had ever seen. These structures became living, breathing organisms with their own arteries and reserves, capable of weathering not just an assault, but the slow, grinding agony of starvation and thirst that followed. The evidence for this incredible foresight is etched into the ruins of the Indus Valley civilization, at sites like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Here, archaeologists have uncovered a stunning feature: massive, fortified citadels that loomed over the lower city. And within these heavily defended complexes, they found rows of large, carefully designed brick platforms with air ducts running beneath them. These were no ordinary foundations, they were the bases of enormous public granaries. This was a revolutionary concept. By centralizing the city's grain supply and storing it within the most defensible part of the city, the Harappans created a powerful tool for resilience. In times of peace, these granaries likely functioned as a form of economic regulation, a buffer against lean harvests where surplus could be stored and then distributed to prevent famine. But in times of war, they became the ultimate key to survival. A city could lock its gates and wait, its population sustained by the grain held safe behind its innermost walls. The enemy outside could camp for months, but as long as those granaries were full, the city's spirit and its stomach would remain full as well. This was strategic planning on a breathtaking scale, turning a simple storehouse into a symbol of unbreakable defiance. The Romans, in their characteristically systematic way, took this concept and engineered it to a staggering degree of sophistication, particularly with the most precious resource of all, water. While their aqueducts are rightfully famous for snaking across the landscape, their terminal points within the city walls were feats of engineering all their own. The aqueducts didn't just empty into an open pool, they fed into massive, enclosed distribution tanks called casella, which were often integrated into the city's fortification system. From these secure hubs, lead or ceramic pipes would then carry water under the streets to public fountains, bathhouses, and the homes of the wealthy. But the true genius lay in the hidden reserves. The city of Constantinople, for instance, was famed not just for its massive land walls, but for the vast subterranean cisterns built beneath them, like the magnificent basilica cistern with its forest of recycled classical columns. These were not mere basements. They were colossal, waterproofed caverns that could hold millions of gallons of fresh water, enough to sustain the entire city for months if its aqueducts were ever cut by an besieging army. The walls above provided the protection, while the hidden world below provided the means to endure. This principle of integrated storage extended to every facet of a city's defense. Armories were never left as standalone buildings. They were strategically placed within the thickness of the wall itself or in towers that dotted the curtain wall. This meant that in the heat of an attack, defenders didn't have to make a desperate and exposed run across the city to fetch arrows, spare swords, or pots of pitch to heat and pour on the enemy. The weapons were right there at the point of need, passed along the wall walk from secure storage to the hands of the soldiers. This efficient distribution of force was a critical multiplier of a garrison's effectiveness. Even trade was designed around this logic of secure distribution. The gatehouses of major cities were rarely just tunnels. They were often complex, multi-story structures with rooms built into their sides. These spaces were prime, protected real estate for small market stalls, creating a vibrant economic zone right at the city's entrance. A farmer bringing his goods to market could sell them immediately in the safety of the gatehouse shadow, and a merchant could have his imports taxed and sold without them ever needing to be hauled through the entire city, minimizing disruption and maximizing security. The wall wasn't just a lifeline in crisis, it was the central hub of daily economic life, proving that the line between survival and prosperity was often as thin as the stones they were built upon. This profound, practical mastery over the elements of survival provided the stable foundation upon which ancient societies could build something far more ambitious than mere endurance. They could begin to map the very heavens themselves onto their earthly domain. Yet this profound, practical mastery over the elements of survival provided the stable foundation upon which ancient societies could build something far more ambitious than mere endurance. They could begin to map the very heavens themselves onto their earthly domain. The wall, in its most transcendent role, became a literal extension of the cosmos, a carefully calibrated instrument designed to harmonize human existence with the divine order of the universe. This was architecture as an act of worship where every stone was placed not just for earthly defense, but to reflect a sacred, celestial blueprint. For these cultures, the universe was a place of perfect, divine geometry, and their most important structures were their humble attempt to echo that perfection on earth, creating a point of connection between the mortal and the eternal. The sprawling temple complex of Angkor Wat in Cambodia is perhaps the most staggering example of this principle in action. To the untrained eye, it appears as a series of magnificent concentric walls and moats surrounding a central tower. But to a 12th century Khmer pilgrim, this was nothing less than a walking tour of the Hindu cosmos, rendered in stone and water. The vast outer moat represents the mythical cosmic ocean. The long causeway across it is the rainbow bridge to the realm of the gods. The successive concentric enclosure walls are the mountain ranges that ring the center of the universe in Hindu mythology, and the 5 soaring central towers are the 5 peaks of the sacred Mount Meru, the abode of the gods and the axis of the world. Every step a worshipper took from the outer edge toward the inner sanctum was a symbolic journey from the profane world to the divine center, a physical reenactment of a spiritual ascent. The wall here was not a barrier to keep people out, but a guided path to lead them in toward enlightenment. It structured not just space, but the entire spiritual experience, making the abstract concept of the cosmos tangibly real and navigable. This desire to anchor a city or temple to the cosmos through its walls was a global phenomenon, though expressed in vastly different ways. Far from the jungles of Southeast Asia, on the windswept hilltops of ancient Britain and Ireland, the Celtic peoples demonstrated a similar preoccupation with celestial alignment. Their massive hill forts, enclosed by vast earthen ramparts and stone revetments, were often positioned with a precision that defies coincidence. Archaeoastronomers studying sites like Maiden Castle in England have found that the entrances and key features of these forts are frequently aligned with significant solar events, particularly the sunrise on the summer or winter solstice. This suggests that the placement of these formidable defenses was dictated by a dual purpose: the practical need for a defensible high ground and the spiritual desire to build their community stronghold in a location already sanctified by the sun's most powerful and symbolic moments. The wall, in this context, captured and framed the celestial power, bathing the entire settlement within in a divine light at the most potent times of the year. This sacred connection was often reinforced by the very orientation of the walls themselves, a near-universal feature in temple construction across the ancient world was cardinal alignment, ensuring that the primary axis of a structure ran true east-west or north-south. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to the cardinal points with an accuracy that baffles modern engineers. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the great temples of Egypt at Luxor and Karnak, and the ceremonial centers of the Maya all share this precise geographical orientation. This was not merely for aesthetic symmetry. In many belief systems, the four cardinal directions were sacred, each associated with specific gods, elements, or spiritual qualities. Building a wall that ran perfectly true east-west was an act of spiritual purification, aligning the human-made structure with the fundamental, God-given order of the universe. It was a declaration that this place was in harmony with cosmic law, a small pocket of perfect order protected from the chaos that lay beyond. To pass through a gate on the eastern wall, aligned with the rising sun and rebirth, was a very different ritual experience than entering from the west, associated with the setting sun and the underworld. The surfaces of these cosmologically significant walls were rarely left bare. They were animated with a menagerie of mythical beings that served as guardians and mediators between realms. The imposing gate of the gods at Tiwanaku in the Andes is carved with a central figure flanked by rows of winged messengers, believed to be a depiction of the creator deity Viracocha. Assyrian palace walls were guarded by colossal Lamashu winged bulls with human heads whose very job was to ward off evil spirits. In Chinese cosmology, the entire layout of a forbidden city, with its walls and gates, was protected by a system of astrological animals assigned to each direction. These weren't just decorations, they were a functional part of the spiritual architecture. They transformed the wall from a passive boundary into an active, inhabited threshold, a liminal space where the earthly realm met the divine. The wall became a membrane, and the mythical creatures were its custodians, ensuring that the powerful energies being channeled and contained by the structure remained balanced and benevolent for those inside. Ultimately, this profound spiritual mapping infused the most mundane aspects of daily life with cosmic significance. A farmer living within a walled city designed around celestial principles would experience his entire existence within a sacred geography. The sun would rise each morning directly over the eastern gate, a daily reaffirmation of cosmic order. The annual festival would process along the main axis of the city, retracing the path of the gods. Even the simple act of drawing water from a well located at a cosmologically significant point within the walls connected the individual to a larger, divine narrative. The wall did not separate people from the spiritual world. It immersed them in it, providing a constant, tangible reminder that their community, their harvest, and their king were all part of a grand, universal design. This deep, ingrained sense of living in a universe that was ordered, meaningful, and divinely connected provided a form of psychological security that was every bit as vital as the physical protection the stones offered. It was a sanctuary for the soul, built right into the architecture of the city itself. And so, while these grand cosmological walls connected entire communities to the heavens, their most fundamental and deeply felt role was far more intimate and immediate. For the ordinary farmer, the humble craftsman, and the vulnerable family, the wall was not a symbol of imperial power or cosmic order. It was the difference between a restful night and one spent in terrified vigilance, listening for the howl of a wolf pack or the rustle of an unseen threat in the dark. Beyond the epic narratives of empires and astronomy, the most universal human experience of the wall was as a creator of sanctuary, a guaranteed safe space in a world that was overwhelmingly dangerous and unpredictable. This was security not as an abstract concept, but as a palpable, physical reality that allowed the fragile flame of daily life to keep burning. Imagine the profound psychological relief that a simple medieval village wall offered to its inhabitants. We often picture the Middle Ages through a romantic lens of knights and castles, but for the vast majority of people, life was a precarious existence on the edge of survival. The forests that pressed in on their cleared fields were not places of beauty, but dark, untamed wildernesses teeming with real dangers, not just wild boar and wolves, but bands of desperate outlaws and hungry soldiers left over from some distant lord's squabble. The village palisade, often just a sturdy fence of sharpened logs with a single guarded gate, was their first and only line of defense. It transformed a scattered collection of huts into a community with a defined inside and outside. Within that wooden ring, children could play without a constant watchful eye, livestock could be corralled safely away from predators, and families could sleep with a measure of peace. This security was communal, a shared project that required every able-bodied person to contribute to its construction and maintenance, forging a powerful bond of mutual dependence among neighbors. The wall was quite literally the thing that held the village together, both physically and socially. For those with a bit more means but still far from the aristocracy, this need for personal security led to some of the most distinctive domestic architecture in history. Look at the Scottish borderlands, a region plagued for centuries by brutal cross-border raids known as the reivers. Here, the answer was not a village wall, but the fortified tower house. These were not castles in the grand sense, but stark, tall, stone homes for a single extended family or clan. Their design was pure, brutal function. The ground floor was typically a windowless storehouse for animals and grain. The only entrance was a heavy door on the first floor, reachable only by a narrow, removable wooden ladder. The family lived on the upper floors, and the whole structure was capped by a roof platform for lookouts. When word of a raid spread, the family would pull up the ladder, bar the door, and hope their thick stone walls could withstand the assault. It was a grim way to live, but it was effective. The tower house was a declaration that a man's home was indeed his castle, a fortress where he alone was responsible for the safety of his own. It represents the distillation of the wall's protective function down to its most essential personal scale. This sacred promise of safety reached its most powerful and poignant expression in the concept of sanctuary. Throughout the medieval world, the walls of a church or monastery were recognized as inviolable refuge. This was a right enshrined in both religious and secular law. A person fleeing from violence, whether a criminal pursued by a mob, a debtor chased by creditors, or a political refugee escaping the king's guard, could claim sanctuary by physically touching the ring on the church door or by entering the churchyard. Once inside, they were under the protection of God and the church, and could not be forcibly removed for a set period, usually 40 days. This gave them time to negotiate a settlement, arrange for safe passage, or prepare for a trial. The church wall created a temporary but absolute bubble of safety in an otherwise merciless world. It was a powerful check on unchecked vengeance and a remarkable acknowledgement that even the lowest member of society had a right to seek mercy and due process. The stone of the church wall was the physical guarantor of that divine mercy. This hard-won security was vigilantly maintained. The night watch was a standard civic duty in every walled town and village. Teams of ordinary citizens, armed with little more than a lantern, a pike, and a horn, would walk the ramparts and patrol the silent streets through the long, dark hours. Their job was to be the community's eyes and ears, to spot a flicker of fire before it became an inferno, and to sound the alarm at the first sign of any trouble approaching the walls. This system of shared vigilance meant that security was not just the job of a few professional soldiers. It was the responsibility of every citizen who benefited from the wall's protection. It fostered a culture of watchfulness and mutual care, reinforcing the idea that the wall was a shared project that required constant participation. The trust this system required among neighbors was itself a form of social glue, strengthening the community from within. Ultimately, this profound sense of personal and communal safety was the essential precondition for everything else. It is nearly impossible for culture to flourish, for commerce to thrive, or for innovation to spark when every waking moment is consumed by base survival and fear. The wall, by creating a predictable and secure environment, provided the stable platform upon which civilization could be built. A potter could invest weeks crafting an intricate vase, confident it wouldn't be smashed by raiders. A merchant could store surplus goods, knowing they would be there to trade next season. Scholars could debate philosophy, and artists could paint frescoes, their minds freed from the constant, primal anxiety of physical threat. The wall did not just protect lives, it protected the very possibility of a rich and complex human life. It was the silent, steadfast guardian of all the soft, vulnerable, and beautiful things that make a society worth defending in the first place, a necessary foundation for the very activities it would soon be used to watch over and control. But this promise of sanctuary and security, so vital for daily life, came with a profound and often unsettling trade-off. The very walls that offered protection from external threats also created an unprecedented platform for those in power to watch, to count, and to control the population within. A wall doesn't just keep people out, it neatly packages people inside, turning an entire city into a manageable and highly surveillable unit. The elevated walkways and towering battlements, designed to spot an approaching army, offered a perfect vantage point for authorities to monitor the everyday movements of their own citizens, transforming architecture into an instrument of social control long before the concept of a police state ever existed. The ancient Chinese capital of Xi'an, home to the famous Terracotta Army and the eastern terminus of the Silk Road, presents a masterclass in this panoptic function. Its massive, imposing walls were not a continuous, blank barrier. They were studded with nearly 100 watchtowers, each one strategically placed to provide overlapping fields of vision. From these elevated stone perches, guards had a commanding, unobstructed view of the city's major thoroughfares, market squares, and residential districts. Their primary duty was indeed to look outward for military threats, but their gaze was equally turned inward. They could spot a brewing street fight, identify a gathering crowd that was getting too large for comfort, or track the movements of a suspicious individual through the maze of streets below. This created a pervasive, low-grade awareness among the populace that they could potentially be watched at any time. a psychological deterrent against disorder that was just as effective as the physical deterrent against invasion. The wall wasn't just a shield, it was a one-way mirror, allowing the state to see without being seen, fostering an atmosphere of order through the simple, unnerving possibility of observation. This concept was refined to a high art during the Renaissance in Europe. The walls of cities like Lucca in Italy or Avila in Spain featured wide, continuous ramparts accessible by broad stone staircases. These were not just defensive platforms for repelling attacks, they were elevated promenades that allowed patrolling guards to oversee the entire city. An archer stationed on the wall of a Renaissance city could literally look down into the courtyards of homes, over the walls of private gardens, and into the public squares. This architecture created a radical asymmetry of vision. The citizen on the street could only see a small, immediate part of their world, while the authority on the wall could see almost everything. This made crowd control remarkably efficient. If a protest or riot began to form in a marketplace, guards could be directed along the wall walk to the precise point above the disturbance, where they could use projectiles or simply their intimidating presence to disperse the crowd long before it could march on a government building. The wall acted as a rapid response highway, allowing a small force to project its influence across the entire urban area with speed and precision. The points of entry and exit, the city gates, became the most critical nodes in this system of control, functioning as the ancient world's equivalent of a border checkpoint, a census bureau, and a public health office all rolled into one. Every person and every cart that entered or left a city had to pass through these narrow, heavily guarded funnels. Guards stationed here were more than just soldiers, they were administrators. They could question travelers about their business, inspect cargo for contraband, and most importantly, they could count. By monitoring the flow of people and goods, city officials could maintain rough population estimates, track economic activity, and even conduct impromptu censuses. This information was power. It allowed for more efficient tax collection, informed military conscription lists, and helped plan for grain supplies to prevent famine. The gate was a data collection point, and the wall was the barrier that forced all of that data to flow through it. This control took on a terrifyingly modern dimension during outbreaks of plague. When the Black Death swept through Europe, city walls became the ultimate tool of quarantine. The gates could be, and often were, sealed completely, cutting the city off from the outside world in a desperate attempt to keep the contagion out or, horrifically, to contain it within. Guards were posted not to keep invaders out, but to prevent anyone from leaving or entering, enforcing a total lockdown with lethal force if necessary. Within the walls, health officials might use the structure of the city itself to enforce isolation, sometimes even walling up entire streets or districts where the disease was rampant, condemning the sick and the healthy alike to their fate in a brutal, pre-modern attempt at containment. The wall, in these moments, revealed its most chilling potential. It could be a prison as easily as a refuge, a tool of absolute biological segregation where the need for collective survival brutally overrode any notion of individual liberty. This inherent tension between the safety provided by the wall and the freedom it inevitably restricted was not lost on the people who lived within them. The same stones that allowed a mother to let her child play in the street without fear of wolves also allowed a corrupt official to monitor her husband's political activities. The gates that protected the city from bandits could also be slammed shut to prevent peasants from fleeing a tyrannical landlord. The wall was always a double-edged sword, a bargain where security was purchased with a measure of autonomy. This ancient dilemma, how much oversight is too much, and what price are we willing to pay for safety, echoes powerfully in our modern debates over surveillance cameras, data tracking, and national borders. The watchtowers of Zion and the guarded gates of medieval Europe were the precursors to a conversation about power, privacy, and control that we are still very much entangled in today, proving that the questions raised by these ancient stones are anything but ancient history. Yet long after the last sentry descended from the ramparts and the final torch guttered out, the walls they left behind embarked on their most enduring role. They ceased to be instruments of any living will and became instead something far more potent, a boundless source of inspiration. Their silent, imposing presence seeped into the very wellspring of human creativity, fueling our myths, adorning our canvases, and giving shape to the stories we tell about ourselves. The physical barrier, in time, became a psychological and artistic archetype, a powerful symbol that artists and storytellers have returned to again and again to explore the deepest themes of the human condition: separation and connection, safety and imprisonment, the known and the unknown. Our oldest stories are already crowded with legendary walls, their fates intertwined with the heroes who stood before them. The epic siege of Troy, immortalized in Homer's Iliad, revolves entirely around the impossibility of breaching that city's famed walls, said to be built by the gods Poseidon and Apollo. For 10 long years, the conflict isn't just between Achilles and Hector. It is between the relentless ingenuity of the Greek army and the implacable stone that shields the Trojans. The wall is a central character, a defining obstacle that gives the epic its structure and its tragedy. In a single, brilliant stroke of myth, the walls of Jericho take this concept and turn it on its head. Their story is not about a long siege, but about a miraculous, instantaneous collapse, brought down not by battering rams but by faith and the sound of trumpets. This narrative flips the script on the wall's invincibility, making it a symbol not of human power, but of a divine power that can shatter any human-made barrier. From their very inception in our collective imagination, walls were already layered with contradictory meanings. They represented both ultimate security and a challenge to be overcome by either martial might or heavenly intervention. This symbolic power made the wall an irresistible metaphor for poets and writers grappling with internal, emotional landscapes. The wall transforms in their hands, becoming a stand-in for the intangible barriers we all face. The great American poet Robert Frost explores this beautifully in his masterpiece, Mending Wall, with that famous, ambivalent line, "Good fences make good neighbors." The poem isn't about agriculture. It's a subtle and deep meditation on the human tendency to build boundaries between properties, between people, and within our own minds. The annual ritual of repairing the stone wall becomes a metaphor for the maintenance of these personal divisions, questioning whether they foster healthy relationships or simply perpetuate isolation. Emily Dickinson, in her profoundly introspective work, used wall imagery to describe the confines of the self and the soul's struggle with limitation, writing about the internal difference / where the meanings are, implying walls within the consciousness itself. This literary device allows writers to give a tangible, physical form to the most abstract of our emotional struggles: grief, loneliness, social alienation, or the protective barriers we erect around our hearts. Visual artists, too, have been captivated by the wall's stark symbolism and powerful forms. The Romantic painters of the 19th century often depicted ruins, crumbling castle walls overtaken by nature, to evoke feelings of awe, the sublime, and the inevitable decay of human ambition in the face of time. A century later, the surrealist René Magritte painted an impossible brick wall floating in a cloudy sky, divorcing the object from its reality and forcing the viewer to confront it as a pure, disquieting idea. In modern times, the wall has found its most dynamic expression not on canvas, but on the concrete canvases of our cities. Street artists like Banksy use actual walls as their medium, subverting the wall's original purpose of exclusion to make a very public, often anti-establishment statement. His art, painted illegally on the very symbols of authority and division, turns the wall into a site of protest and dialogue, a powerful reclamation of space for public commentary. The Berlin Wall itself, perhaps the most potent political barrier of the 20th century, became one of the world's largest and most heartbreaking collaborative art projects on its western side, covered in murals that expressed longing, anger, and hope until the day it finally came down. And in our contemporary mythology, the grandest stage for these ancient structures is undoubtedly the world of film and television, where walls are given a scale and drama befitting our largest screens. The fantasy epic Game of Thrones built its entire central premise around the wall, a colossus of ice 700 feet high, guarding the civilized South from the supernatural threats of the frozen North. It is a breathtaking visualization of a border, so massive it becomes a world unto itself, with its own culture, its own military order, and its own terrifying purpose. It embodies every function we've discussed: defense, exclusion, surveillance, and a liminal space between the known world and utter chaos, all amplified to a mythical level. It is the ultimate wall, and its eventual fall is the culmination of the entire story. Similarly, the dystopian film Snowpiercer takes the concept of social stratification and makes it terrifyingly literal, with the poor literally crammed into the tail of a train and perpetually fighting their way toward the privileged front cars, each one a gated community on rails. These modern stories prove that the wall remains one of our most powerful narrative tools, a shortcut to creating immediate stakes and exploring profound themes of power, inequality, and the human desire to see what lies on the other side. This enduring cultural resonance, from ancient epic to blockbuster spectacle, shows that a wall is never just a wall. It is a story waiting to be told, a blank slate upon which every generation projects its deepest fears and its most fervent hopes. But long after their final gates were sealed and their last defenders stood down, these ancient walls embarked on their most unexpected and vital role. They ceased to be instruments of living power and became something far more valuable to us today, the most patient and revealing history books ever written, their pages made of stone, plaster, and soil. For modern archaeologists, a standing wall is not the end of a story. It is the glorious beginning of one, a multi-layered archive waiting to be read, layer by literal layer, to uncover secrets its builders never intended to share. This science of reading history through layers is called stratigraphy, and a wall is one of its most perfect subjects. Think of a major city wall, like those of ancient Rome or Jerusalem. It was rarely built in a single campaign. You can often see clear lines where one emperor added a new section, or where a later civilization patched a breach with a completely different style of masonry. Each of these phases is a chapter. By carefully excavating the ground right up against the wall's foundation, archaeologists can collect pottery shards, coins, and other datable objects that were dropped during each construction phase. This turns the wall into a giant ruler for measuring time, providing fixed points that help date everything else found in the surrounding city. A coin of Emperor Vespasian lodged in the mortar of a Roman wall doesn't just date that wall, it helps date an entire stratum of the city, creating a chronological anchor that can be used across the entire site. The wall becomes the backbone of the historical timeline, but the treasures aren't just found next to the walls, they are often hidden within them. the compacted rubble and soil used as infill inside the walls of a Mesopotamian ziggurat or a Celtic hill fort can be a time capsule, preserving microscopic environmental evidence. Archaeobotanists can take samples of this material and, through a process called pollen analysis, extract ancient pollen grains. These tiny, nearly indestructible particles tell us what plants were growing in the region when the wall was built. A high percentage of oak pollen suggests a dense forest was cleared for the project. A spike in wheat or barley pollen might indicate that the construction coincided with or enabled a period of agricultural expansion. This data allows scientists to reconstruct the ancient climate and landscape, understanding the environment the wall was built to dominate. Of course, the most direct and poignant voices from the past are often found written on the walls themselves. While official inscriptions boast of imperial glory, it is the informal graffiti that offers an uncensored, street-level view of life. The volcanic ash that buried Pompeii did more than just preserve buildings, it preserved human personalities. Scratched into the plaster of a tavern wall near the city gates, you might find a candid message like the famous one that reads, "I screwed the barmaid," a boastful claim from 2,000 years ago that needs no translation. Elsewhere, political campaign slogans are painted next to gladiator fan club symbols, creating a vibrant tapestry of public discourse that feels instantly familiar. These aren't the carefully curated words of historians. They are the raw, unfiltered voices of ordinary people, their hopes, their crudeness, and their humor forever etched into the very fabric of their city. It's a powerful reminder that the past was populated by real, complex individuals, not just statues and kings. For linguists, walls have sometimes provided the key to unlocking entire languages that had been lost to time. The most famous example is the Rosetta Stone, which is itself a fragment of a much larger stone stela, a kind of wall panel. Its parallel texts in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic Egyptian provided the critical cipher that finally allowed scholars to read the thousands of inscriptions covering Egyptian temple walls, opening up a vast library of history, religion, and science that had been silent for centuries. Similarly, the Behistun inscription in Iran, carved on a cliff face, repeated its proclamation in 3 languages, allowing 19th-century scholars to decipher the cuneiform script of ancient Mesopotamia. In these cases, the wall didn't just hold a message, it held the very instruction manual for understanding an entire civilization. Perhaps the most haunting function of a wall is its role as a time capsule during sudden, catastrophic abandonment. When a city is slowly abandoned over centuries, people take their valuables and the historical record becomes scattered. But when disaster strikes instantly, as it did at Pompeii or at the Bronze Age city of Akrotiri on Santorini, sealed by a volcanic eruption, everything is frozen in place. The walls become the silent witnesses to the final moments. At Akrotiri, magnificent frescoes were preserved on the very walls they decorated, showing a sophisticated, vibrant society in stunning detail. The layout of tools against a wall, the position of furniture, the stores of grain in pots, all of it is captured mid-action, providing an unparalleled snapshot of daily life that no carefully buried tomb or trash pit could ever hope to match. The wall here is the frame around a perfectly preserved moment, a window we can look through directly into a world that ended in a single, terrible day. These silent stone witnesses hold the power to completely rewrite the narratives we thought we knew, proving that the most enduring stories are not always written on parchment, but are often waiting, patient and immutable, in the very stones our ancestors left behind. Yet, after exploring their incredible complexity, from celestial calculators to economic engines, we arrive at a great irony. The very walls that were so multifaceted in their own time have been flattened and simplified in ours, reduced to a single, powerful, and often misleading symbol. Our modern gaze tends to see these structures through a narrow, contemporary lens, stripping them of their rich history and projecting our own anxieties and politics onto their silent stones. This act of simplification does a profound disservice to the past, turning a symphony of human ingenuity into a single, monotonous note of division. Perhaps the most famous victim of this oversimplification is the Great Wall of China. In the popular imagination, it is a solitary, serpentine sentinel built in a single, heroic effort to keep the marauding Mongols at bay, a purely military project. This view, while not entirely false, is spectacularly incomplete. It ignores the wall's vital role as the world's most heavily fortified customs and immigration checkpoint. For centuries, it was less a barricade and more a regulated turnstile on the Silk Road. Guarded gates like the Jiayu Pass were bustling centers of commerce and cultural exchange, where officials taxed luxury goods, monitored the movement of people, and enforced imperial trade policies. The wall didn't stop trade, it managed it, funneling wealth directly into the Chinese state's coffers and controlling the flow of ideas as much as the flow of armies. To see it only as a weapon is to miss its function as a wallet and a welcome mat. This reductive view is often fueled by modern nationalism, where ancient walls are co-opted as simplistic symbols of a nation's eternal and unified identity. A country might point to a ruin within its borders and claim, "We have always been here and we have always been united against them." This ignores the messy, complicated reality of history. Hadrian's Wall in Britain, for instance, is sometimes framed in popular culture as a clear dividing line between civilized Rome and the barbaric Scottish tribes. This narrative overlooks the vibrant trade that occurred across its gates, the cultural blending in the communities that grew around its forts, and the fact that many Roman soldiers stationed there were themselves recruited from those so-called barbarian tribes. The wall was a border, yes, but borders are not just barriers, they are also zones of contact, negotiation, and hybridity. Nationalist stories prefer the clean, heroic myth of pure defense over the tangled, human reality of interaction. Our mass media, from Hollywood blockbusters to simplified documentaries, often perpetuates these misconceptions. Filmmakers need visual shorthand, and a massive wall is an easy way to signal, "Keep out." So we see depictions of ancient cities where the walls are nothing more than a bland, uniform stone ring, manned by identical soldiers with a singular purpose. The bustling, multi-ethnic market just inside the gate, the temple walls covered in astronomical markings, the hidden cisterns and granaries. These vital, life-giving functions are edited out to serve a simpler, more action-oriented plot. The wall becomes a backdrop for battle scenes, its true character as the city's heart, mind, and soul left on the cutting room floor. We are shown the sword, but not the scales, the scroll, or the sundial that were just as important. This tendency to project our modern biases onto the past is a constant danger. We look at an ancient wall and immediately frame it in the context of today's heated debates over immigration and border security. We assume that the primary motivation behind, say, the walls of ancient Mesopotamia must have been a primal fear of the other, a desire for ethnic purity, or an ancient version of isolationism. But this is a profound misreading. While security was always a concern, the primary driver was more often economic control and the demonstration of state power. The goal wasn't necessarily to create a homogeneous society behind the walls. It was to create a prosperous and orderly one, which often involved managing and taxing a diverse population of locals and foreigners alike. We judge the past by the standards and preoccupations of the present, and in doing so, we blind ourselves to the entirely different set of values, priorities, and worldviews that actually guided its builders. By consciously correcting these misconceptions, we do more than just get the facts straight. We open a window into the sophisticated minds of our ancestors. We start to see them not as primitive brutes cowering behind piles of rock, but as savvy engineers, shrewd economists, meticulous astronomers, and visionary urban planners. We appreciate that a society capable of organizing the labor and resources to build such a structure was capable of incredibly complex thought. Understanding that a wall was also a customs house, a temple, a calendar, and a legal boundary forces us to confront the breathtaking complexity of historical societies. It humbles us, revealing that our own modern world, for all its technology, is not the first to grapple with intricate problems of governance, economy, and social order. This clearer, more honest perspective is essential because it prepares us to engage with the next and perhaps most difficult question about these enduring structures. Having stripped away the modern myths to see the ancient realities, we are now forced to confront the deep and enduring ethical dilemmas that these walls, in all their complexity, inevitably raise. Yet long after the dust settled on these grand construction projects and the last stone was set in place, the echo of the hammers was replaced by a far more persistent and haunting sound, the sound of human questioning. For every wall ever built is more than just an engineering feat. It is a permanent physical question posed to the future. It asks us to consider the price of safety, the nature of community, and the very essence of human trust. These ancient stones force us into a conversation about ethics and philosophy that has raged for millennia and continues to define our modern world in the most profound ways. The debate is as old as the walls themselves. In the 6th century BC, the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, the legendary founder of Taoism, offered a piercing critique that cuts to the heart of the matter. In the Tao Te Ching, he wrote, "Though a country may be ringed with high walls, if it is governed according to the way, the people will be content." Armies are instruments of ill omen. The wise ruler uses them only when he has no choice. For Lao Tzu, the very need to build a massive wall was a symptom of failure of governance, a failure of harmony, and most of all, a failure of trust. A truly well-ordered society, in his view, would be so inherently peaceful and just that it would have no need for such monumental displays of defensive insecurity. The wall, to him, was not a symbol of strength but a colossal admission of fear and a manifestation of the ruler's inability to create a righteous and secure state through virtue alone. It represented a turn away from the natural flow of the Tao, the universal way of harmony, and toward a path of forced control and paranoia. This philosophical stance stands in stark contrast to the pragmatic view held by countless rulers and strategists throughout history. From the Roman emperors to the architects of medieval castles, the prevailing wisdom was that walls were not a sign of weakness, but the fundamental prerequisite for civilization itself. The Roman historian Tacitus, though often critical of imperial excess, put it bluntly when he had a Roman general declare that without forts and fortifications, there could be no peace in the provinces, no secure base from which to project order. This perspective argues that Lao Tzu's vision is a beautiful ideal, but a dangerous fantasy in a world containing real conflict, ambition, and scarcity. Walls, in this view, create the very security that allows Lao Tzu's way to flourish within their embrace. They provide the stable, predictable environment where laws can be enforced, commerce can thrive, and culture can develop. The wall isn't the enemy of community, it is its essential protective shell. This tension between the ideal of a borderless world and the practical need for security is a debate we have never resolved. Perhaps the most painful ethical wound associated with these structures is the immense human cost of their construction, a cost often paid by the most vulnerable. The legend of the 1 million workers said to have died building the Great Wall of China, their bodies buried within its ramparts, is a powerful folk memory that speaks to a brutal truth. While the exact numbers are likely exaggerated, historical records and archaeological evidence confirm that massive wall-building projects were almost invariably fueled by conscripted labor, forced tribute from conquered peoples, and convicts serving sentences. This was state power exercised in its most raw and coercive form. The magnificent walls of Constantinople, for instance, were famously rushed to completion by the Emperor Theodosius II by mobilizing the entire city's population, with every citizen, regardless of class, forced to contribute labor. This raises a deeply uncomfortable question. Can we truly admire these magnificent achievements of human engineering when we know they were built on a foundation of suffering and oppression? The wall becomes a paradox, a symbol of communal safety for those inside, constructed through the brutal negation of individual freedom for those who built it. This leads us directly to the central philosophical dilemma that walls embody, the eternal balancing act between security and freedom. A wide open gate offers maximum freedom of movement but also maximum vulnerability. A sealed gate offers perfect security but at the cost of becoming a prison. Every walled society throughout history has had to navigate this spectrum, and their choices define their character. Does a society wall out the world to protect its unique culture and laws, as ancient Sparta famously did, risking stagnation and xenophobia? Or does it keep its gates open for trade and new ideas, as Athens often did, accepting a higher level of risk for a more vibrant and dynamic culture? The wall is the physical manifestation of that choice. It forces a society to ask itself, what are we so afraid of that we are willing to live within a cage of our own making? And what freedoms are we willing to sacrifice at the altar of absolute safety? These are not abstract academic questions. They are the very same questions that underpin our modern debates over immigration policy, digital privacy, national security, and globalism. The border walls and cyber firewalls of today are the direct descendants of Jericho and Babylon, and we are still wrestling with the same fundamental trade-offs. Ultimately, these ancient stones hold up a mirror, and the reflection we see is our own human nature. They are monuments to our duality, our deep-seated need for belonging and community within a defined space, and our equally powerful fear of the unknown that lies beyond it. They represent our incredible capacity for collective action and sacrifice to achieve a common good, and our tragic willingness to exploit and dominate others to make it happen. A wall is a neutral structure. It is the human intention behind it that gives it moral weight. It can be a life-saving shield for the innocent or an instrument of oppressive segregation. It can be a haven for cultural preservation or a barrier to vital exchange. The ethical judgment lies not in the stone itself, but in why it was built, who it was meant to protect, and who it was meant to exclude. By studying the choices of the past, we are not just learning about history, we are engaging in the most critical conversation of all: what kind of world we want to build, and what kind of walls, both physical and metaphorical, we are willing to live with or without. This profound reflection on the human condition finds its counterpoint in the remarkable, tangible legacy of the materials and methods used to bring these philosophical dilemmas to life. Yet this profound philosophical legacy, born from the choices of rulers and thinkers, was only made possible by the tangible, gritty reality of stone and mortar. To understand the true depth of ancient wall building, we must move beyond the abstract and into the quarry, the workshop, and the kiln, where raw earth was transformed into civilization's most enduring signature through a combination of brute force, chemical genius, and artistic vision. The selection and processing of materials was not a mere preliminary step. It was a sophisticated science and a high art form, a testament to a deep, hard-won understanding of the very earth itself. This was where theory met practice, and the results were nothing short of alchemical. Consider the humble mud brick, a technology so simple it seems almost childish. But in the hands of the ancient Egyptians, it became the backbone of an empire. They didn't just dig up any mud. They sought out the perfect, dense clay from the Nile's banks, meticulously mixing it with just the right amount of straw, not as a binder, but as a miraculous structural polymer. The straw fibers created a network of micro-reinforcement within the brick, drastically reducing shrinkage and cracking as the brick dried in the scorching sun. This prevented the weaknesses that would have caused the entire wall to fail. They then poured this mixture into standardized wooden molds, creating bricks of a consistent size that could be laid efficiently by teams of workers, creating a rhythm of construction that allowed for the rapid raising of massive enclosure walls around temples and storage yards. The choice to sun, dry rather than fire them was a calculated one, conserving enormous amounts of precious fuel that could be used for pottery or metalworking instead. This was sustainable, resource-efficient engineering on a colossal scale, a perfect adaptation to their environment that produced walls which have survived, in some places, for over 5,000 years. This mastery of local materials stands in stark contrast to the Roman approach, which was one of conquest and synthesis on a chemical level. Their crowning achievement was opus caementicium, a Roman concrete. This was no simple recipe. Its key ingredient was pozzolana, a volcanic ash mined from specific deposits around the Bay of Naples. When this ash was mixed with lime and water, it triggered a phenomenal chemical reaction, a pozzolanic reaction, that created a crystalline structure far stronger than lime mortar alone. Even more miraculously, this concrete gained strength over time, especially when exposed to water, making it perfect for harbor walls and foundations. The Romans understood its properties so intimately that they used different aggregate mixes for different applications. For massive foundations, they used heavy, dense rock. For the upper sections of walls or domes, they used lighter stones like pumice, effectively inventing lightweight concrete to reduce the overall load on the structure. They would then often face this incredible core with a skin of finely cut brick or stone, creating a composite structure that was both immensely strong and beautifully finished. This material innovation was their true secret weapon. It allowed them to build faster, higher, and more durably than any civilization before them, stamping their architectural identity across 3 continents with a permanence that still defies time. Behind every stone in these walls lies a story of incredible labor and logistics, a symphony of coordination that began deep within the earth. Quarrying was a science in itself. Egyptian obelisk quarries show us how workers would dig deep trenches around a single block of granite, then use wooden wedges that were soaked with water to expand and fracture the stone along precise lines. The Romans developed advanced techniques for extracting massive ashlar blocks using channels and levers, but then came the truly Herculean task: transport. How do you move a 100-ton block from a quarry in Aswan to a temple site in Luxor? The Egyptians did it with sheer numbers, sledges, and ingeniously prepared mud brick ramps lubricated with water. The Incas, high in the Andes, likely used a system of log rollers and earthen causeways, coaxing these gigantic puzzles pieces up and down impossible mountain slopes with a patience we can scarcely imagine. This was not mere brute force, it was a profound understanding of physics, friction, and large-scale labor management. The wall was not just built, it was orchestrated from the moment the first hammer struck the quarry wall to the final setting of the capstone. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this ancient craftsmanship is the knowledge that was lost. The Romans had mortar recipes that created bonds stronger than the stone itself, a technology that would not be rediscovered until the invention of Portland cement in the 19th century. The specific mixing and pouring techniques for their underwater concrete, used in harbor walls, remain a subject of active scientific research today. The Inca method for shaping their polygonal stones so precisely that they interlock without mortar is a complete mystery. Some theories suggest they used a combination of precise measuring, stone-on-stone grinding, and perhaps even the application of certain plant acids to soften the rock surface slightly. These were not random experiments, they were the products of generations of accumulated knowledge, passed down from master to apprentice in a continuous chain of practical learning. The collapse of their civilizations broke these chains, and secrets that took centuries to perfect vanished in a few generations, leaving us with ruins that we can still barely explain, let alone replicate. This lost wisdom stands as a humbling reminder that technological progress is not a straight, inevitable line upward, but a fragile thing that must be actively maintained and passed on. This legacy of material mastery is not confined to the past. It is literally the bedrock of our modern world. The Roman use of a strong, poured concrete core within a decorative stone facing is the direct ancestor of every modern skyscraper, which uses a steel or concrete frame behind a glass and aluminum curtain wall. The Inca understanding of flexible, jointed structures to withstand seismic forces directly informs the principles of base isolation and energy dissipation used in earthquake-resistant buildings today. The chemical principles behind Roman concrete are now inspiring the development of new, more durable and environmentally friendly cement mixes. When we look at an ancient wall, we are not just looking at a historical relic, we are looking at a foundational chapter in the ongoing story of human engineering. The anonymous masons, quarrymen, and mortar mixers were the unsung geniuses of their age, and their painstaking work provided the essential toolkit for building the world we live in now. This deep, tangible connection to the physical world, this transformation of earth and stone into a testament of skill, provided a stable and sacred foundation for the final, most intimate function of these structures, not as feats of engineering, but as stages for the rituals that defined a community's very soul. But perhaps the most profound way walls served as educators was by becoming the very sites where knowledge was not just displayed, but enacted and experienced through powerful rituals. These stones, so often associated with division and exclusion, were also the sacred stages for the most important transitions in a person's life, the thresholds where a boy became a man, a soldier became a hero, and a community reaffirmed its deepest bonds. The wall was not a silent observer of these events. It was an active, essential participant, its very presence transforming a personal moment into a permanent part of the cultural fabric, a living lesson in what it meant to belong. This role as a backdrop for rites of passage was deeply woven into the architecture of many ancient cities. Consider the journey of a young Hopewell man in pre-Columbian North America, preparing for his first vision quest. His path might have led him to the massive, serpent-shaped earthwork wall in Ohio, a structure that aligned with the celestial movements of the sun and moon. Touching a specific, consecrated stone within that earthen wall wasn't a superstitious gesture. It was the physical act of connecting with generations of ancestors who had undertaken the same ritual. The wall was a tangible link to the past and the cosmos, a place where the abstract concept of adulthood was made real through contact with the cold, enduring earth. Similarly, a Spartan hoplite in ancient Greece about to march to war would pass through a specific gate in the city walls. This was no casual exit. It was a ceremonial act watched by priests and elders that marked his symbolic death as a civilian and his rebirth as a warrior whose only path back home was through victory or a hero's burial. The gate frame acted as a metaphysical doorway, and crossing its threshold was the final, irrevocable lesson in his duty to the state. Beyond individual initiation, the very act of constructing a wall was itself one of the oldest and most powerful communal rituals. In cultures from the Andes to ancient Ireland, the raising of a significant wall was never just a construction project. It was a civic and spiritual event that involved the entire community. Every member, from the chieftain to the common farmer, would contribute a stone or labor to the effort. This wasn't merely about efficiency, it was a physical metaphor for the society they were building together. Each person's effort, no matter how small, was literally embedded into the defenses of their home, creating an unbreakable bond of mutual responsibility and shared identity. To have helped build the wall was to have a permanent, tangible stake in the community's survival. It was a brutal, hands-on lesson in civics, teaching that collective security depended on collective sacrifice long before any enemy ever appeared on the horizon. Archaeologists have found fascinating evidence of how these rituals were literally cemented into the foundations of power. Across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to Shang Dynasty China, rulers would bury elaborate foundation deposits beneath the corners and gateways of their new walls. These were not simple time capsules. They were carefully chosen collections of sacred objects, inscribed clay tablets declaring the king's pious intentions, precious stones, ceremonial weapons, and sometimes even sacrifices, meant to appease the gods of the underworld and secure their divine blessing for the structure above. By sealing these offerings within the wall, the builders were performing a kind of spiritual alchemy, transforming a pile of stone and brick into a living entity with a soul and a divine mandate. The act of depositing them was a critical part of the ritual, a lesson for all witnesses that the king's authority was not just derived from military might, but was rooted in a sacred covenant with the gods themselves. This ritual life of a wall continued long after its construction was complete. In medieval European towns, it was common for the entire populace to participate in an annual beating the bounds ceremony. On a designated day, a solemn procession led by priests and town officials would walk the entire length of the town's ramparts. They would pause at each tower and gate to offer prayers for the city's protection, and in a more physical reminder, young boys might be lightly bumped against the stones at key points. This seemingly peculiar practice was a multifaceted lesson. It was a ritual of purification and protection, asking for divine favor. It was a practical exercise in civic geography, ensuring every generation knew the exact boundaries of their jurisdiction. And most importantly, it was a powerful performance of community unity, where every social class walked together along the structure that defined and protected them all, reinforcing the wall's role as the great social equalizer in the face of external threats. Finally, walls provided the ultimate stage set for the most important political and spiritual ceremonies of state. The coronation of a new pharaoh in Egypt wasn't complete until he appeared before his people on a balcony specially built into the palace walls, his silhouette framed against the sky, literally elevated above everyone else. This architectural framing was a critical part of the theater of power, teaching the masses the divine nature of kingship through a breathtaking visual spectacle. Likewise, the signing of a pivotal peace treaty was often orchestrated to take place at a city's main gate. This location was chosen with profound symbolic purpose. The gate was the seam between two worlds, the inside and the outside, us and them. To sign an agreement, there was to transform that seam from a line of conflict into a line of contact, teaching a powerful lesson about the potential for diplomacy to redefine the very purpose of a barrier. Through these rituals, the wall transcended its physical form to become the most potent teacher of all, its lessons written not in ink, but in ceremony, memory, and stone, preparing a society not just to defend its past, but to understand its place in the world and build a foundation for its future. Yet long after the rituals ended and the crowds dispersed, the silent stone of the wall continued its work, transforming from a stage for ceremony into the most permanent and public classroom the world has ever known. In an age long before paper, schools, or the printing press, how did a society teach its people the laws, share its history, or pass down the complex knowledge of the stars? The answer was etched, painted, and carved into the most durable canvas they possessed, the very walls that surrounded them. These structures became vast, open-air encyclopedias, turning every citizen who passed by into a student and every gatehouse into a lecture hall. This was education on a monumental scale, designed not for a privileged few, but for the entire community, ensuring that the core tenets of civilization would be preserved in the one place that was built to last forever. The most powerful example of this is not a sprawling mural, but a single, towering piece of stone. The Code of Hammurabi, a complete legal document from ancient Babylon, was inscribed on a black diorite stele that stood proudly in a public place for all to see. This was a revolutionary act. For the first time in history, the law was not a secret set of rules whispered by a king to his judges. It was a permanent public promise. Any Babylonian, whether a wealthy merchant or a humble farmer, could approach the stele and see the prescribed punishment for theft, the rules for inheriting property, or the standards for fair trade. The wall here, in the form of this upright stone slab, was the ultimate authority. It created a society based on the concept of the law of the land rather than the whim of the ruler. It educated the populace on their rights and responsibilities, and it held the powerful accountable by making the rules of justice visible to everyone. This was the birth of transparent governance set in stone for eternity. Within the sacred confines of Egyptian temples, the walls served a different but equally vital educational purpose. The inner walls of places like Karnak and Luxor were not simply decorated. They were meticulously transformed into comprehensive illustrated textbooks for the priestly class. Every available surface was covered in hieroglyphs and elaborate reliefs that detailed intricate religious rituals, spells from the Book of the Dead, and the complex genealogies of the gods. For a young priest in training, walking these halls was like moving through an immersive, three-dimensional library. He could learn the precise words to say during an offering to Osiris by reading the captions next to a carved scene. He could study the correct posture and tools for a specific ceremony by examining the figures frozen in stone. This visual and textual information was a curriculum, ensuring that the incredibly detailed and precise nature of Egyptian religious practice could be passed down with perfect accuracy from one generation to the next, preserving a theological tradition for thousands of years without a single word being lost in translation. This educational function extended to the most practical and advanced sciences of the ancient world. On a less grand but equally fascinating scale, we find evidence of walls being used as scratch pads for apprentices and scholars. In ancient Greece and Rome, the plastered walls of courtyards and public porticos sometimes bear the faint traces of geometric diagrams or complex mathematical calculations, likely etched with a stylus by students working through problems. In India, the walls of certain observatories feature permanent astronomical diagrams, carved maps of the constellations or charts tracking planetary movements that served as visual aids for teaching celestial navigation and calendar calculation. These walls were the blackboards of the ancient world, spaces where abstract concepts could be visualized, debated, and perfected. They turned the act of learning from a private, solitary exercise into a public, collaborative endeavor, where knowledge was a shared resource literally written on the walls of the community. Ultimately, the wall itself became the site for the most dynamic form of ancient education, the public lecture. In the Greek agora, philosophers like Socrates and Plato would gather their students in the shaded colonnades, their discussions framed by the decorated walls that spoke of past heroes and civic virtues. In the Roman Forum, a citizen could stop and listen to a lawyer arguing a case before a painted backdrop of historical victories, or a rhetorician practicing a speech. The acoustics of a city gate or a curved wall could amplify a single voice, allowing a teacher to address a large crowd without any technological assistance. The wall provided the setting, the acoustics, and often the visual context for the transmission of ideas. It fostered a culture of public discourse and democratic learning, where wisdom was not locked away in a private library, but was performed and debated in the shared spaces defined by these enduring structures. In this final, profound role, the wall completes its journey from a divider of space to a unifier of minds, proving that the greatest barriers we build can also become our most powerful bridges to knowledge, understanding, and a shared future. From economic engines to spiritual guides, we have journeyed together through the hidden lives of ancient walls, uncovering a truth far richer than simple stone and mortar. These structures were the silent, multifaceted partners in the grand project of civilization itself. They were not inert backdrops to history, but active participants regulating the lifeblood of trade in bustling gatehouses, etching social hierarchies into the very landscape, whispering the movements of the stars through aligned stones, and broadcasting the glory of kings and gods in breathtaking reliefs. They were calendars, canvases, and capacitors for entire cultures, protecting not just people, but the very ideas, beliefs, and knowledge that made a society unique. This exploration reveals that their greatest strength was never their height or thickness, but their astonishing adaptability to serve almost every human need imaginable. This legacy challenges us to look at the barriers in our own world, both physical and metaphorical, with a more discerning eye. The next time you see a wall, whether it's a historic remnant in an old city, a border fence on the news, or even the personal boundaries we set in our own lives, remember the ancient lessons. Consider not just what it is designed to keep out, but what it is built to protect within. Does it foster prosperity or stifle it? Does it create community or enforce division? Does it inspire awe or only fear? The stones of the past ask us these questions of the present, urging us to build and break walls with intention and wisdom, understanding that their impact extends far beyond their immediate line. Our journey through time shows that the most enduring walls were those that served a purpose greater than exclusion. They were those that sheltered markets, housed knowledge, marked sacred time, and told a community's story. Their true power lay in their ability to enable life, not just to prevent death. They teach us that strength is found not in isolation, but in creating a space secure enough for culture, commerce, and connection to flourish. If this glimpse into the depth of our shared history has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to share your own thoughts and reflections in the comments below. What modern wall, ancient or new, fascinates you the most? For more deep dives into the secrets hidden in plain sight all around us, be sure to subscribe and join our community. Thank you for your time and